Ben didn't know how far they were going with each jump, only seeing the change in scenery each time a portal was opened while the full group filtered through. What he did notice was that Pato wasn't taking as many breaks as he'd expect from Steph, initially impressing him with his mana pool until he noticed the band on his arm. One of the mana bracelets he'd made had clearly been supplied, either because the man held an awakened magic or because he was acting as the form of transportation, and it wasn't until he spied the same bracelet on Phone's wrist that he got his answer. It seemed that after going to the various healers of the world, they'd been distributed to some of its awakened skill holders, all while the planet waited for Ben to create more. A task that would become significantly quicker the moment he finished putting so much of his mana to soul production, and would hopefully be speeding up significantly in only a few days once he was finally free of not only that job but every other one as well. Just gotta finish this first. He couldn't help but eye Vividus's experiments as he thought it, already designing the report before any fighting had begun as he gauged their mental states, trying to sort through what he was seeing in their minds to determine what was coming from the trauma of their loss and what was coming from their physical change. While a handful of them seemed mostly fine, his expectations when it came to the mental health of anyone who'd lost everything and had their bodies radically altered had proven justifiably low. The changes needing more time than they'd gotten to adapt to that already left him questioning the overall validity of the attempt. Saying you'd be willing to do anything for power and revenge was one thing, but seeing a face that wasn't your own in your reflection was an entirely different psychological blow that he felt uncomfortably sure might rear its ugly head, either sometime during their observation or during something far more important in the future when they'd be sent out to fight. Still, with the former prisoners on the planet to worry about, he wasn't going to invest himself in a completely different group that needed some mental help. All he could do was point it out to the best of his ability when his reports were submitted as they finally ended up near their first destination. Phone holding up a hand for silence. This should be the approximate location. Are any of you picking anything up? He asked, addressing the chimeras specifically to get a feel for their own tracking ability, with about a quarter of them nodding. Most interesting to Ben was that their success didn't seem to hold any correlation with whether they held a partial or an integrated body skill, nor the level in the case of the latter, meaning it was either coming down to differences in the way Vividus had modified them or else was connected to their base biology, perhaps even being enhanced in some way by their modifications. It was another thing to take note of, and Ben made sure to pay attention to which one said they could pick up signs of the demons to compare against their skills once he recorded the results as the group moved off to fight the first of the hordes. All of them tried to keep as quiet as they could to not draw any unwanted attention, no matter how unlikely that was to succeed. There were too many of them to be truly silent as they moved through the woods, with even footsteps making a noticeable noise when there were so many of them. But another issue came back to the ones they were supposed to be observing. It was clear that even if they were comfortable, they weren't all entirely used to their new bodies, and peeking through the memories of the closest ones within his range, it seemed the answer as to why was clear. They had only been altered a few short weeks ago, near when the second wave had ended. That simply wasn't enough time to get used to such a major change, another thing that was going to make it into his report, with a special emphasis going to be placed on the need for some sort of physical therapy to adjust to the physical alterations on top of the mental strain. Stolen story. Please report. Vividus's lack of care for mortal life beyond what she could get out of them was clear to see through their creation. Focused on power and performance but nothing else, and with the sound of pounding feet rushing towards him, he was finally going to get the chance to watch them in that regard at least, with the results being an undeniable success. He knew they were chasing down one of the larger groups of demons that needed to be hunted, but as they rushed at them, the chimeras reacted just as swiftly with all of their violence and hate behind the act, with their side outnumbered at least 4-1 but tearing through their attackers like they were made of paper, ripping through flesh and snapping bones as they moved in a hateful swarm to kill all they could. It wasn't instantaneous, but it was enough to tell that no matter what the end results of their recommendations were going to be, more chimeras were going to be made. Be it hundreds or thousands, there'd be plenty of nations that would want to encourage their people to submit to those changes if it meant getting that much power in a fighting force, and there'd be plenty of people who'd want it no matter what it meant going through. If they won, then the Great Life Spirit really would be leaving her genetic legacy on the planet. He and the rest of them didn't need to do anything from there as the rest of the demons were hunted down. There was no room for them to get in the way. All they could do was watch as they slowly regrouped once the battle was done. All of them covered in blood, while so little of it was their own as Thera turned to phone. "Can I start healing them?" "I'd say only the most severely injured, but I'm not sure if any qualify. All of you, if you have a wound you think will impede you for the next group we're attacking, then come here for treatment, but otherwise, if it's only cuts and bruises, hold out for now. You don't need to worry. I have more than enough mana. Even if it means healing smaller wounds. It's not that. These are a group that are being tested to fight against the next wave. We need to see how well they hold up. Add in the time it will take to treat them all, then, even if it's going to be small, it will delay us." "Will we really be delayed after that?" Ben asked. "I didn't get the impression we expected it to be so quick." The question got a thin smile from their leader, impacted by what he'd just seen as well. "No, I suppose with how things went we're currently ahead, but the first point still stands. We don't want anyone dying, nor do we want them too injured to fight, but we need to see how well they'll all stand up to everything they'll be expected to go against. Even if it feels cruel to hold off, it's better to understand what they can stand up to now rather than allow things to be too easy and risk them crumbling when the third wave comes." It seemed none among them were injured enough that they felt they needed any healing either, so the two let the matter drop, understanding the point enough that they weren't going to try and fight it, especially not when all parties were still in shockingly good shape. He could see it made Thera uncomfortable too. By all accounts, her aunt had taken advantage of people so she could experiment on them, but as far as preliminary results went, it had worked, and there'd be plenty who'd say it had been worth it, especially if it saved the planet in the end. While having his own complicated feelings on it all as well, with his chance acquisition of his demon body skill acting as the inspiration for the line of experimentation that had ended with the people he saw before him, he at least was less against it in theory. A group of 50 at every gate wouldn't be anywhere near enough to stop the invasion alone, but it would be able to take a comfortable bite of anything that came their way, even if another thought was whispering in his head. The third wave is going to bring their awakened skill holders. It was a point he was trying to ignore for the time being. After all, it wasn't going to be nothing but awakened skill holders, and no matter the level of the skill itself, lower tiers could still kill them through any number of ways. Even if things would be worse than what they were currently seeing, any bit of extra help they could get would be something worth taking. It was a few short jumps to their next location, the second group they were supposed to be going after close enough to the first now that they were all so far out and everyone filtered through to the new stretch of woods, with Phone already looking to the chimeras. "Found anything yet?" "Further west," one said, with enough of the others in agreement that they started walking, keeping on guard the entire time for anything that might come, and their voices low, with Ben taking advantage of the lull to train a few of his skills the best he could, with deep connection still being the most important one. One of the first ways he'd learned to use it was out in the woods after all, treating it as a bug killer by exposing his greater mind to creatures that just couldn't handle that contact. His mental structure had grown in ways he never would have expected back in those distant days, though, and as much as he enjoyed the bit of comfort that use of skill provided, he turned his training to something of a gentler sort. As he stretched out his soul as far as it could go, he took in any insect that came close enough and threaded the smallest bit of himself he could into each one without causing them harm before taking them over completely with another skill, making the bodies of hundreds of small creatures his own to use, as he joked with himself. Really putting the hive in hive mind. It was a skill that seemed useful and was already growing quickly thanks to the powerful job he was currently under along with so many of the others he'd finished, but it was still a challenging one to train to its full potential due to the ethics of it. When treating it like he had before it had awakened, to only strengthen the minds of those around him and more efficiently share information, it was fine, but there were laws about so thoroughly taking over another, with its new form going beyond even the scope of dark magic in some cases. It had its limits since, unlike that magic, it could only be used in the area he could reach out with using deep connection, but it had strengths that made up for that in droves. It was an affinity, meaning nobody like him would have a natural resistance to its effects, and more importantly, it wasn't even a magic since it didn't cost mana. It was a result of linking his soul with another's, which meant even something like magic nullification wouldn't be able to stop his effects, and they would go on for as long as he was awake to use it. As for how anyone could escape it, he had his theories, but without testing the skill on far too many people, he wasn't actually sure what might let a person break it off. Soul magic was almost certain since he'd already had the effects of Connect blocked by it before, and he wouldn't be surprised if a more powerful mind could overcome it, leaving only the question of if any minds more powerful than his own actually existed. Beyond that, though, was a mystery that wouldn't be answered by his current test as he looked at the surroundings through hundreds of compound eyes, feeling what little they each had of minds, incorporating their structure into his own for what minor changes it would bring. And still it wasn't enough to really strain him, even as the number of bugs he was controlling went up, leaving him to increase the difficulty by adding in another skill as he actualized a few more around him, maintaining their existence to train that skill too, and topping it off by continuing on with something he'd never actually given up on as more souls were materialized around him, praying for the notification he so desperately wanted. He continued on with it all for a while too, and with how big the range of deep connection currently was, he was largely staying out of the way of the group, but as the number of bugs he was managing changed from hundreds to thousands, it was eventually noticed. "Hell, a lot of pests in this area," Pato finally said, wrapping himself in a thin layer of death mana to act as a simple bug killer, the same way Ben would for his Connect, with Phone seeming to agree. "Enjoying this book? Seek out the original to ensure the author gets credit. MMH, just a moment. You may all feel a brief tingle." It seemed figuring out tricks for dealing with bugs when off in the deep woods was something common for the adventurers who spent so much time out there, and their current leader discharged some static into the environment, giving them all a small shock but frying Ben's growing swarm, breaking his connection to them all and leaving their small bodies to fall to the ground, putting a pause to that bit of training. I guess I should minimize how many bugs I use in a crowd so it doesn't annoy people. Next time I'll keep it to only a few hundred and keep them on the outer edge of the range of my skill. Something he was already starting, with plenty of small test subjects filling the woods that only got put further on hold as half of the chimeras froze, noticing the demons they were searching for, noticing them in kind as both groups now moved to encounter one another. The chimeras darted off once the sounds of pounding feet grew loud enough, off to meet their prey, while the adventurers followed from behind to watch, seeing what looked like it was going to be a repeat of the first clash, as the demons were met with an unexpected level of power as the front row were torn through before the ones who'd lagged behind the initial rush of them had a better showing, casting their magics before some of the chimeras could react, balls of fire and stone hitting them and slowing them down. Slowing but not stopping. The skin Vividus had worked so hard to make for the group seemed as powerful as she'd led them to believe, resisting the powerful strikes without major bits of damage from any of their foes, even as the blows began to build once the demons changed the forms of their attacks, making them sharper when they could and hitting with tooth and claw while trying to build up hits in the same spots to get through it, starting to show some success in their attempts as the swarm fought with all they had until the battle took a darker turn. The Chimera's attacks largely changed from the demons to each other as the rest of the adventurers Ben was with didn't immediately understand what was happening until he spoke, already feeling what was going on in the few minds he was close enough to touch. "They're currently under a dark spell that's affecting who they perceive as enemies. Phone, permission for us to step in before the guys we're supposed to be watching all kill themselves. Granted. Can any of you spot the caster so we can try to put an end to this?" Thera was already holding forth her staff as he asked, preparing a spell of her own. "I can. 1 second. It would have been easy for her to just end things there. It looked like there were only a few hundred demons to be dealt with, and while they would get past the chimeras at any moment now that they were fighting each other, she had the power to solve things in any number of ways to defeat the demons and free the chimeras from their control. But that wasn't what she did. The purpose of that outing was to see how her aunt's creations would handle real combat, so all she did was use her dark sight and dark sense in tandem to find the demons casting their spells and eliminated only them, letting the chimeric groups slowly free themselves from the effects they were under as the source of mana powering the spells was cut off, as eventually they all got back to their true task of killing the demons surrounding them. With the entire confrontation acting as a strong negative mark in the report Ben was already forming in his mind. Dark magics were difficult to deal with, that was true, but they also had a weakness other magics simply didn't. While that form of magic could be weakened like any other affinity magic based on the strength of the resistances a person held, the mind aspects of those branches of spells could also be resisted through willpower alone if one had the mental strength for it, something far too many of the chimeras lacked. Ben didn't intend to hold that fact against them though, far from it. The fault lied entirely in the selection process Vividus had for choosing them. Using subjects who had lost everything may have been the easy option, but they were still reeling from those same losses. Combining that fact with the emotional struggles plenty were dealing with from having their bodies so radically altered, and they were all the perfect targets for any sort of mind effects. It all tied together into a pretty significant weakness, one that could be exploited for the worst. There was always a chance that during the wave someone could come under dark effects and be forced to fight their allies, but with how strong the chimeras had been made, that could be even more disastrous than it normally would be. Taking what he'd just seen and his evaluation made, Ben already knew that his report would be filled with recommendations for a genuine screening process, even as the fighting came to an end. Looking around, Phone taking stock of how things had ended up as well as the damage the chimeric group had taken. Their leader asked one question before making any firm choices. "Can any of you detect any other demons in the vicinity?" He looked at the chimeras and all of them gave a negative before turning to the rest of the adventurers, getting the same and leaving their leader to nod. "All right. Given how that turned out, we'll be taking a break for a couple hours, so everyone make sure to eat and get a bit of rest. Thera, I'm sorry, but if I could ask you to deal with the wounded." "Of course," she nodded, looking at the rest and seeing results far worse than from the first encounter. While there were no broken bones or lost limbs, she was seeing cuts deep enough that they could become problems in the future if they weren't treated, along with what looked like swelling from some injuries that she wanted to properly appraise. "For now, anyone who's actively bleeding with me. I'll look over the rest of you after." She spoke with the firmness of a healer far too used to unruly patients, and without a word the group moved at her orders, the most obviously injured going her way while the rest of them got settled as Ben made a fire to begin cooking, pulling ingredients from his rings to pull together a simple meal, and very quickly noticed eyes moving to him as they smelled the food he was putting together. What others had packed was largely dried goods. Something simple that could be stored and consumed for what was supposed to be a couple days out in the woods, but largely lacking in terms of flavor. Then there was himself, the holder of an 8th-leveled awakened crafting, cooking around them. The food he could make might as well have been hard drugs in comparison, with not only the heightened senses of the chimeras making them extra aware of that fact, but even the adventurers they'd come with. Even Pato and his party, who had the advantage of an awakened space magic, which meant he could carry larger volumes of ingredients without having to worry about space, were looking over, ignoring their meal that was much the same in terms of dried meat with only the benefit of some fresh fruit to go along with it, telling him that none of them were much in the way of cooks, and leaving Ben to sigh as he turned to Phone, who was at least trying to be slightly less obvious about his desires. "Hey Phone, I don't mind cooking for everyone so long as anyone who wants a bowl supplies some ingredients for me to work with, if that's cool with you." "You heard him," the Oni said, getting up and offering some of his own dried meat, just as attracted to the smell of what Ben had already been making as anyone else. "All of you just make sure you're going to be polite about it if you take him up on that." With the offer out, people started to move, with the chimeras not in the middle of treatment coming to offer some of their dried goods, while Pato came over to offer some of his group's available fruits and vegetables, looking like he wanted to say more but holding back to let Ben cook. Which first meant pulling some more raw metals from his rings, reshaping them to make a large enough pot for the amount of people he now needed to feed as he prepared what he'd consider a simple stew, using some of his own supplies to help fill it, even if he was making good use of what he'd already been given. Materializing water and some of the compounds that existed within the meat cells he'd learned to materialize. He could now in essence create a broth on demand before using it with his material manipulation to force the dried meat he'd received to take in some of the liquid to rehydrate it, while at the same time softening it with the destructive aspects of that same skill, creating something far more tender than it otherwise would have been before pulling out a knife to dice some of the vegetables, again using his magic to help break them down faster to speed up the cooking process. Once done, he materialized salt and pulled a few more seasonings to add before deciding to make it just a bit thicker by materializing the fruit cells he'd learned to create without connecting them into a greater whole, letting them easily break down to improve the texture of the broth. This tale has been pilfered from Royal Road. If found on Amazon, kindly file a report. From there, it became a matter of micro-adjustments, using his material sense in tandem with his magic to see which bits could be further softened for an optimal eating experience before he was comfortable calling it finished, leaving him to materialize bowls and spoons for the people around him to take advantage of and a ladle for himself to distribute. "All right, Food's ready, so come and get it. Hmm? Already? Phone asked, walking up for a bowl as he looked it over with a hint of interest. There'd been times on overnight outings he'd made soups with some of his preserves just for the variety, but that had always been a matter of hours instead of the minutes they'd just watched. If anything, it seemed like all Ben had done was only enough to warm the ingredients, not actually cook them, but Ben just smiled. The benefits of being around a master craftsman. Things come together a bit easier than they would for most people. It's all ready to eat, and even if it's not going to be the best thing I've ever made, I'm willing to bet it's going to be one of the best you've ever eaten out in the woods. Ah, my apologies. I did not mean to doubt you when you were so generous. Thank you for the food. The way his 3 eyes lit up after having his first taste told everyone all they needed to know, and it wasn't long before the rest came over for their own bowls, all of them giving high evaluations the moment they tasted it and leaving Ben to distribute bowls to the ones Thera was still working on healing before handing one to his girlfriend, as well as she finished up with the main group in need of treatment, letting her take a break as they talked to the side. So, what do you think of them so far? I don't know, she sighed as she ate, trying to keep somewhat quiet about it. I don't want to sound like I approve of what my aunt's done, but at the very least, she's good at it. Each of them healed so easily compared to a normal person. I think the wounds probably would have been gone by tomorrow even without my intervention, and taking a closer look at their bodies. Well, they're unreasonably well put together. Gonna make me jealous hearing that. You know what I mean. I've never given much thought to how a person's physical structure is set up beyond trying to make sure it's put back to its regular state after they've been injured, but what I'm seeing, she's reinforced areas that I know get prone to injuries in most species, and she must have made dozens to hundreds of minor alterations that I can't begin to guess the reason behind beyond just minor boosts to efficiency, and even then I'm not certain of exactly how it's improving things beyond a few guesses here and there, but from what we've seen so far it's pretty obvious it's worked. No matter how the last fight went, both have shown just how much power she was able to build into them, and I don't know. How does all of this look to you? It has its trade-offs, he admitted. They're powerful, that's for sure, and if they're going to be fast to heal even without the intervention of a life mage, that's all the better. But they're struggling a lot more under the surface than any of them are trying to let on. You can't just take traumatized people and turn them into soldiers, even if they are just a proof of concept. Hell, you can't be traumatizing them more either. For me, coming to this world was hard enough at first, but I have no clue how I would have reacted if the gods had made me a body that didn't look anything like me. If Vividus is going to so deeply alter their appearances in all future attempts, then even if she finds volunteers in perfect mental health, that could easily have an effect, and it's looking pretty obvious that it's making it easier for dark magic to take hold. Of course, that also means it's going to be easier to use that magic on most people, given that most of the world is probably some degree of traumatized from the invasion, so looking at it that way, is it even worth considering? I honestly don't know. There was a lot to consider and plenty still to look at, but if Ben was going to have to give an answer as to whether they'd be worth it as he was seeing things then and there, the answer he'd have to give was a hesitant yes. He still had his worries, but all of the chimeras had already proven their strength compared to an average demon, and as far as he could see, none of them had any proper training to let them really take advantage of that strength. But what if that boost of power was given to a soldier who was already skilled in fighting, or a mage who would then be able to fight right in the wave instead of keeping their distance when they'd cast their spell? Hell, what about altering some healers so they could more easily participate on the front lines, or any runners that had the job of trying to pull any injured fighters into the safety of the fortresses instead of fighting head-on? There were a million places worth having people in various jobs getting a bit more strength and durability, and with the positives currently outweighing any negatives and the great life spirit willing to provide, why shouldn't the world take advantage of it? No matter what issues would be going into his report, he could already see a world where those changes would become more common. All he could do was ensure it would be as complete and detailed as possible to allow any potential person who'd undergo those changes to make the most informed choices they could. So with that in mind, he left Thera to treating the more minor injuries after they finished eating, while he went to a group of the chimeras sitting by themselves, wanting to see what other answers he could find. "Hello there. Hope you've all enjoyed the food," he said brightly as he made his way to the group of 5, taking a seat on the ground with them before they could answer, with one speaking up after he'd joined them. "It was delicious, thank you. I didn't think adventurers would eat so well. Only when they're with me. It's the benefit of bringing along a guy who can cook." He laughed, trying to create a good atmosphere to get them to open up a bit and largely failing. With each person he was with mostly wanting to keep to themselves and leading him to switch his approach to something a bit more direct. Now, as you're all aware, I've been asked to evaluate you guys, so I hope you don't mind me asking you all a couple questions. I just want to get a sense for how you feel about things. Go ahead. The same one answered as the others nodded, all willing to give him some time since they'd been instructed to be cooperative, making things a bit easier for him on that one front. Cool, in that case, let's start with the obvious. Do you regret agreeing to let Vividus alter you? No. I don't. No. No. Okay. Would you reverse the process if you could? No. Me neither. I don't think so. No. I wouldn't. Have any of you suffered any psychological effects that you think might stem from having your body changed? I haven't. Nor I. I don't think so. No, I'm fine. No. He continued asking more questions, trying to probe them deeper for what answers they would give, and on the surface, they kept insisting that things were fine, that they'd wanted the results they'd gotten, and that anything would be worth it if it meant they'd be able to kill whatever demons they found. But that was only on the surface. Their minds told a different story, a subconscious reaction they thought was safe in their heads if not for the mind reader secretly at their sides. From that perspective, each question gave different answers. Discomfort from seeing how they'd been changed and a general feel in their bodies they couldn't escape, with the alterations not unpleasant but alien in a way that required far more time to adapt to than they had gotten before being sent out. As for the questions of if they regretted it or if they'd undo it, what that brought was waves of complicated emotions as they struggled to manage what they'd thought they'd wanted with what they'd received and whether it was worth it in the end. The deeper he looked, the more he was sure the answer was a firm no, but in the surface levels of their thoughts they were doing their best to justify it, convincing themselves that they'd made the correct choice instead of alienating them from the very images they had of who they were, with those themes being consistent as he went from group to group. Sure, there were a few who were strangely fine with it no matter how he'd probed, even one that reveled in it, but by and large he would describe what he was seeing as a negative in the majority of their lives that too many were trying to convince themselves was actually fine now that it was done. They'd made their choice, and for whatever positives and negatives it held, they'd have to live with it. Okay, my main takeaway is that if Vividus wants to do this on a bigger scale in the future, then she needs to do a mass psychological evaluation on all of her potential subjects. I think I'll recommend she get Funa's assistance for that. I don't know if Vividus would listen, but it would let her get someone who is actually somewhat more specialized in dealing with mind issues and who also has enough basic morality that she'd stop her from doing anything too unethical. Once he was done, he found Thera and took a seat beside her, laying down on the ground to try and organize his thoughts. He didn't like what he'd seen in any of the ones he'd spoken to, and they'd clearly been taken advantage of when they were vulnerable, but who was to say it hadn't been worth it in the long run? No matter what they were going through as a result of it, Vividus had objectively improved their survival odds. Each chimera was immediately more equipped to withstand whatever would be thrown at them. Couldn't that justify it in the end? God. I don't know, he muttered as he covered his eyes, taking what small time to relax he had until it was time to deal with the next group of demons, with Thera feeling largely the same. Yeah, this is a bit less exciting than I thought it would be. Ha, the wonders of a first-ranked quest. You ready to retire? We could enjoy our next few months of life without needing to worry about being dragged by someone else's whims. Pass. One day they'll call us for something a bit more exciting and a bit less, well, whatever this is. I just know it. Ha! Then I guess we'll see. Not like I actually get to just sit back and do nothing for months, adventurer or not. Too much to do, trying to fit what most would consider a lifetime of work in the months they had left, all to reach his various goals. He could quit the guild then and there, but that wouldn't reduce his workload by a drop in the end. All it would do was change how he used some of his time. It was as he was thinking that some others approached the two of them, with the 4 girls within the one full party coming over. Hello? Thank you again for the food earlier, the half-elf Galdus said with a small bow. We don't usually get to eat so well, but it was delicious. Ah, no problem. Glad to know you guys enjoyed it. If things end up stretching long enough that we stop for a second meal, then I can cook again if everyone wants me to. With if being the main question. Even if there had been a hiccup in the last fight, The Chimera group had still gone above and beyond expectations, ending things fast enough that what should have been a multi-day expedition could very well end sometime into the evening if the rest went smooth enough, even if those four still seemed to appreciate the offer. The tail has been illicitly lifted. Should you spot it on Amazon, report the violation. If we get the chance, we'd enjoy that, she smiled. But we were actually hoping we might get the chance to take your partner for a bit to chat. If you'd be willing, of course, Miss Thera. Given the sheer number of magics you hold, Twee and Azizal were hoping to get some advice, and myself and both have an interest in the topic as well, if you don't mind letting us pick your brain. I don't mind, but you're honestly going to want to be asking Ben for advice more than me. He gained access to the full magic library, and I can say with certainty he would know more about both water magic and corpse song than I do, no matter what levels I have. That seemed to stump the group as they looked amongst each other, not sure where to go from there, and Ben gave them an out. Even if they would like some advice, they're also trying to make an opening where Pato could talk to me, he told her, ignoring the looks he got when from their perspective it seemed he'd seen right through their intentions, not aware he'd been reading their minds. Still, since he was working with them, he could both take the time to chat about whatever the man wanted as well as be helpful to the rest of the party, so he materialized books on what he knew of both water magic and corpse song to hand to the two mages without a word as he focused in on Thera. No reason not to give him some time since we're working together, and it would be good to get the chance to talk. Otherworlder to otherworlder. Seems like they really do want to learn a bit, though, so why not take the chance to see how you do at playing teacher? Kind of feel like he could have just come over to ask to borrow you. Seems like he's trying to show more tact than I am. Don't worry, it will be fine. MMH, alright? Just try not to have any repeats with the way things went after the last space mage you'd met. If it seems like there's any chance of that, I'll just immediately scream, so have fun. With reassurances given, Thera let herself be pulled off, even as he received a few parting looks from how he'd brought up both of their statuses as otherworlders and left a window where he could be joined, with Pato soon making his way over, none the wiser to what had been said beforehand. Sorry, it looks like my party left you to yourself. Mind if I join you for a bit? Sure, I wouldn't mind the company, Ben said with a smile, not seeing anything nefarious in the other's mind to make him look for help as the other summoned took a seat on the ground beside him, offering a hand that Ben shook before going quiet for just a moment, trying to put his thoughts in order. Sorry, I know we just met, but I've got a bit of a question for you if you don't mind, he finally said, with Ben answering before he could ask. Yep, I'm one of the summoned, same as you. Ha, well that makes things easy, doesn't it? I take it since you could recognize me, you've met some of my people before? Yuzu and Zilly mostly, although I've seen others. And you've seen some humans? Ah, I was put on a quest with a couple of them before, but I don't actually remember their names, he admitted sheepishly. But they were sent to work with me and some other adventurers through the nations they work for. From the looks of things here, I'm assuming that wasn't the case for you? You independent too? I am, Ben admitted, already getting an uncomfortable sense of where things were going. Great, Pato said, his eyes lighting up with the news. I heard there were a couple others from different groups, but you're the first I met who struck out on your own like me. I gotta ask, what made you do it and how do you feel about it? You regret it at all? There it was, the ever so uncomfortable question that left Ben to ask himself if he should just lie for the sake of smoothness, but ultimately decided against it, giving an honest explanation. My situation was a bit more complicated than that, he admitted before materializing a small ball and lightly tossing it in the air. This? Couldn't do it when I arrived. I couldn't do much of anything. I guess what strengthened everyone else didn't really work on me because of the nature of my soul, so I didn't show up with awakened skills, and my attributes were a whole lot lower too. When it came time for churches and countries to put in offers, I was ignored. Pato's laughter was as powerful as it was expected with the news, but how Ben interpreted it changed as the man at his side lightly slapped his back as he spoke up. And now look at you, he continued to laugh. You got 3 awakened skills to your name all by yourself? Man, I bet every bastard on this world is pulling their hair out for not snagging you when it would have been cheap. That's awesome, guy. I mean, it must have sucked at first, but now? I'd be hella proud. There's a lot more to brag about when you've earned your skill instead of just having it handed over after all. Thanks. A little stunned by the reaction, Ben was at a small loss for words. He was used to getting a range of reactions when people found out about his circumstances, from sympathy to discomfort with at least one case of someone laughing at his situation in a far more negative way, as well as shock for the few who put together how fast he'd been raising his skills, but that had been by far the most positive reaction overall. Not looking down on him in any way and not disbelieving that he'd risen so far, only a pure and positive reaction to what he'd achieved. It made him feel a bit embarrassed, especially when he felt the same emotions in those words coming from the other's mind too, so he redirected the same question, wanting to hear of Pato's life as well. And what about you then? What made you want to strike out on your own, instead of taking the comfy path of having a country hand you over fistfuls of cash? A lot to be honest. Not sure how much you know about my people, but even back home I felt my culture was a bit restrictive. I didn't want to immediately be tossed into another one with new rules to follow when there's this entire world here to see. And other than that, well, you said you've met Yuzu? I know her. She's married to a human. Is she? Good for her. Either way though, in the church we were all put in, you should have seen the reaction when her status was revealed. It was like the rest of us stopped existing, and it felt pretty obvious at the time that from then on, that was how it was going to be. No matter where I went, I'd be seen as the one who wasn't her. He shrugged. Don't get me wrong, I don't have any ill will here. She's a nice girl and I wish her the best, but I don't want to feel like a two-bit player in another person's life. Striking out on my own felt like the best way to make that happen. And do you regret it? Me? Not in the slightest. The whole end of the world thing is a bit of a downer, but I've been enjoying the life I've gotten for all of its ups and downs. Plus, well, look, I feel a bit weird sometimes about my skill level because, like I said, I didn't exactly earn it the way the people who got there naturally did, but having the power admittedly comes with some pretty nice perks. His eyes drifted to the rest of his party as they spoke with Thera off to the side as small spells were cast, and it left Ben to laugh. Like making a small harem? To be honest, yeah, he admitted. It's mutually beneficial and there aren't any real issues though. They know what I was looking for and they get the prestige that comes with working with a first rank. Hell, being in a party with a first rank speeds up other rank evaluations too, so half of them made it to third by having me around, and it looks like the other two just need a couple more levels in some of their skills to get there too now. But we got along really well, and I think there was a real friendship between them beyond that. I wouldn't worry too much on that front. I've got some empathy aspects to some of my skills. I can tell you're well liked with them. He lied to conceal his casual mind reading. Their talk had been going well enough that he didn't want to out himself for such an unexpected breach of privacy, and Pato brightened up from the statement. Am I? Hell, that's always nice to hear. But what about you then? You said partner? Are you and her? Yeah, we're together and I wouldn't want to add any more. Not really my thing. Hey, I get it. I may not be looking for love, but if that did end up on the table, I don't know if things would stay as nice and light as I'm currently enjoying. Course, I've heard a few other summoned are keeping multiple romantic partners, so if I ever meet any from more monogamous societies, I'll have to ask how that's working out. From the one I know, I'd say it's okay, although at some point I think it changed from a harem to something a bit more polyamorous. With that one just so happening to involve a member of your race. Yeah? Good for them then. Life's too short to let things get so complicated. I doubt anyone on this planet could know that as much as people like us. Dying once does give a certain perspective to everything else, doesn't it? Here's to hoping to push off the second time for as long as possible. They continued to chat through the small break, enjoying the chance to talk together as they compared their time living on the world. Still, no matter how good things seem, you've got to remember that this is a dangerous world, even beyond the whole invasion thing. Pato warned as their talk went on. I've seen and been through some crazy stuff since getting here. Yeah? You're not alone there, but that's actually kind of nice to hear. People who live on this planet seem to think it would be pretty sunshine and rainbows if not for the invasion, but I'm pretty sure I've had to deal with a couple attempts on my life each year since I arrived. Seriously, having to avoid being murdered constantly is not normal. No, it isn't. Pato agreed, not having gone through any of that himself, but was open to the chance he may have just been getting lucky on that front. But there's some downright bizarre crap out in these woods too. I'm honestly a bit worried we'll just stumble into something else on our way. Yeah? Like what? Man, it's hard to describe if you don't see it yourself. It doesn't really capture the feel unless you go out to it. But since I can teleport at such a high level, I get sent to do a lot of stuff. Transport and deep expeditions like this aren't unusual, but one of the ones that stands out the most is when we were sent to examine this one area. A huge place. Should have been teeming with beasties, but was left completely dead and desolate save for the plants around it. Okay, a little weird, but the ecosystem of this planet is kind of a nightmare from the hundreds of alien species that were dragged along with the survivors when the gods brought them here. It's possible that some predator moved in and whatever was already living there just wasn't able to compete. Not a bad idea, but that's not what it was. Once you got to the heart of this dead zone, you'd find something. A giant wall, built right in the middle of the woods with nothing else around it, surrounded by red earth. The entire area stained by the sheer quantity of blood that had been spilled there. You don't say, Ben responded, trying to sound casual and sculpting his face to keep any reaction from giving away that he already knew what Pato was talking about as well as who'd been the cause of it all, and to his luck it seemed the other didn't notice, too invested in going on with his story. Trust me, you don't really get the scale unless you see it for yourself, but that wasn't even the worst of it. On the same expedition that sent me out there, me and the others were also sent to look at another area that was maybe even worse. Seriously, just close your eyes and try to imagine this. You're walking through the woods when you start to notice something strange. You can't place your finger on it at first until it hits you. There's something wrong with the trees. All of them have branches that are unusually straight until they start turning at sharp right angles, bending themselves so they all look like cubes. A dash. But not just that. Pato went on. As you look closer, you realize that the leaves on all of them are deformed too. All of them strangely square in shape no matter what species they're from. And if all of that wasn't spooky enough, eventually you see that the nests and hives built in all of the trees were constructed in exactly the same way. Angular in a way nothing would naturally do, and then as you've finally had enough and decide to leave, you get one last shock. What? Ben asked weakly, trying to play his part in the conversation no matter the psychological blow it was dealing him as Pato finished. Even the bugs were affected there. All of them I could see were flying in these unnatural, angular formations. Of everything I'd seen, those two places must have been the scariest. I bet that sure sounds spooky. You don't know the half of it. He sighed before leaning in a bit and speaking softer. Honestly, sometimes I worry a bit that I was affected by whatever was going on there. I still sometimes dream of both of those places. Probably just stress. Ben tried to reassure. I mean, even if something was affecting the life in that one region, it doesn't sound like there was anything in the first you went to, right? Sometimes events just have a habit of sticking with you like that. Even as he said it though, a completely different thought was going through his head. I need to burn those bits of forest down before any more people stumble over and freak out. At the very least, it seemed Pato wasn't the same one who found the demidemons, and with that bit of reassurance given, the other nodded. Stolen content warning. This content belongs on Royal Road. Report any occurrences. Yeah, you're probably right, but it was intense in a way I don't want to repeat. I've been a bit more cautious about whatever Deepwood requests I've taken ever since. Anyway though dash. Alright all, breaks up. Phone called out to them. Let's get a move on for now and try our best to clear as many as we can before taking another. Ah, looks like it's back to work. Pato sighed before standing up and stretching. But it was good getting to talk to you. Next break we get. Make sure to tell me a bit of the stranger stuff you've put up with since coming to the world. Yeah, will do. With their rest over, Pato walked to the front to begin opening portals as Thera moved back to Ben's side once done with giving the other women pointers, looking as uncomfortable as Ben felt on the inside, with the guess as to why not too hard to find. I take it they told you about some of their adventures in the woods. Unfortunately. Same with you. Unfortunately. They said no more on the topic, an unspoken agreement between the two to let the matter drop and pretend they'd never heard anything as they went with the rest, beginning their journey to the third group of demons. It wasn't long between portal jumps that something caught Ben's eye as he waited for the rest of the chimeras to pass through the current gate Pato had opened, with a strong sight of souls off in the distance between the ones filling all of the life of that world to an extent he hadn't seen before. It went beyond what he'd see in the people around him, drawing his interest in a way he wasn't used to and demanded investigation, turning his attention to Phone to ask before running off. Phone, I think there might be something weird out that way. Would it be cool if me and Thera took just a couple minutes to investigate? He looked at Ben in curiosity for a minute before turning to address the nearby chimeras. Do any of you detect anything that might be a demon around? No, said one, with the rest in agreement. Anything over there of note at all? Not that we can detect. Galda, anything? Nothing for me either. I see. And Ben, you're certain there's something over there worth investigating? If it will be worth it, I can't say, but there's definitely something that way. Although if nobody else can't tell, then that would imply to me it might be worth looking into. Very well, then I'll be joining as well. The rest of you stay on guard until we're back. Pato, should anything happen, you're in charge of judging whether to follow or fall back. Understood. Very well, then let's go. Cool, Thera. To make this quick, you mind taking us that way? Can do. She lifted the ground under their feet and carried them the way Ben was pointing, navigating through the trees and beyond to bring what would have been a walk of a few minutes down to less than one, revealing what Ben had been able to see so clearly and instantly putting the other two on guard. Ghosts. A crowd of them in the dozens that was clearer in his eyes than ever before thanks to the new way of seeing he'd gained since he'd last encountered one, as he took them all in for everything they had, trying to determine the changes that existed in them compared to a living soul since he was getting the chance, even as they drifted by, completely unaware of their existence. Phone spoke low as they watched them go, more than aware of the potential danger they posed since the number of them on the planet had exploded with the gate to hell opening only a few months prior. The fact they haven't reacted to us is a good sign, but if they have awareness, we could be in trouble. We should get Pato to deal with them if he can. We won't need to. Thera can handle them, but before we go all in on that, there's another issue that might be worth considering. I can feel something drawing them in. What? I have a few soul skills, Ben explained, keeping light on the details as he connected to the bunch of them. I don't know what it is or how far off they're going, but something is drawing them in the way they're heading and is suppressing their minds to keep them from going off track. It might be worth checking out. And you don't know how far off they are? No idea. Then we don't have the time, Phone said, shaking his head. We have our job and we have to stick to it. None of the remaining groups we're looking for would be in that direction either, so these are completely unrelated, even if the likely culprit is going to be some other group of demons or an animal with a death effect. When we get back, I'll bring it up with the guild, including where we are and the way they're going, but for now we can't just change our objective. Okay, I understand. Thank you. Thera, if you can deal with them, I'll ask you to. Just because we don't have the time to follow them doesn't mean we'll leave them unimpeded. Thera nodded and cast her spell, forcing them to peace as they passed on, leaving that plain and that portion of woods empty as Phone nodded. Thank you. And Ben, good eye. I'm sorry we couldn't investigate further, but if you notice anything else, please continue to speak up. Of course, will do. Good. In that case, let's head back and continue on our way. With the minor detour over and unanswered questions that continued to scratch at Ben's mind, the three went back to the rest and let Pato create his next portal, continuing on their way to the next waiting swarm. Continuing their journey, Thera felt stuck on what they'd seen along the way. She knew that an untold number of ghosts had made their way into the world along with the outsider, but despite the time she still tried to make for the guild on top of her current hospital work, word about sightings were slim. Of course, compared to demons, the dead were largely ignorable no matter what power they might have wielded, and far easier to deal with too. It was even possible that plenty had passed on by themselves, or that the planet's main foes who wielded a natural power over souls were putting them to rest whenever they encountered them for the bit of security that would give. There were plenty of potential explanations, but still it bothered her as she couldn't escape the question of just how many problems there really were on the planet. A question she'd get no answer to beyond the major ones, and once they arrived in the area of their next destination, she wasn't going to have time to think as her eyes turned back to the chimeras, trying to appraise them the best she could despite her conflicted feelings on the matter. As much as it annoyed her to admit it, They were a success already. Power was in short supply, and the easier it was to claim, the better the world would be. If her aunt could so simply lift people up to greater levels of strength when the world hung in the balance, then there was no reason not to take it, no matter what harm Ben was seeing in their minds. Even if it left them traumatized by the time things were done, they and many others could still be alive. It was what she was telling herself at least, but it still didn't sit right with her. Why should those sacrifices be any less villainized than Ibaru, who'd tried to use her own paternal race as a power source, or Naloth, who'd gone and opened the gate to hell to try and get stronger? In the latter case, it would have even only been using people across the universe whose gods had found worthy of hell instead of the most easily manipulated that Vividus could find to take advantage of. With the outsider, it also held almost certainly coming as a surprise to all of the casters involved. She shook the thought from her head. She hadn't been sent to judge the morality of it. If the gods thought it was wrong, then they'd step in. All she could do was the job she'd been given, and stood at attention as Phone started talking. Same as the first 2 times, Phone turned to the chimeras. Anything? He didn't get an immediate response like he had previously, though, with the group looking amongst themselves for a bit before one answered for them all. To the left, he pointed before going on. We think at least. They've been in the area for sure. Their smell is all around us, but that's where it's the strongest. We think they must have traveled that way sometime after we'd received word of where to go. Any guesses as to how far then? Is this a walking distance, or should we teleport? I'd say teleport about 2 kilometers to start. We'll get our bearings again once there. Understood. Pato, you heard him. Got it. A new hole in space opened and they shuffled through, the chimeras sniffing at the air and listening to the surroundings before directing them once more through another portal and then again from there, trying to take them ever closer with each jump and still failing by the 5th, where all of them just looked confused. What's the issue? Phone asked, seeing the looks on their faces and needing information as one answered. Where we're currently at, there's signs in all directions. We can't say where to go. And we're not just surrounded? Phone asked, keeping a hand on his mace, even as the other shook his head. No. There's signs everywhere, but we can't detect anything close either. I honestly can't say what's happening. I see. In that case, the rest of you, can you find anything? He was asking the rest of the adventurers, but with whatever tracking skills they had, it didn't seem to be enough. Everyone shook their heads, with Pato speaking from the side. If you spot this tail on Amazon, know that it has been stolen. Report the violation. We were told if we don't find anything to head off to the next one, yeah? Should we just skip this place and do that? We've only really just started and we're still far ahead of schedule. For now, we'll look around. Pato, open 4 gates about 100 meters out in each direction. We'll see if that can give them a better sense. The adventurer did as he was asked, opening holes in space for the chimeric group to stick their heads through before coming back, giving a negative. Again, there's signs in all of them but nothing clear. We can only assume that if they are around, they're hiding from us. That quieted their leader as he thought it over, trying to decide on the course of action to take before speaking up. Alright, this should be another group of a few hundred, so we can't just leave them if we can avoid it, so we'll be splitting into 4 groups to investigate, with each first rank taking the lead. If we can't find anything in 3 hours, then we'll move on to our next destination, but if you can, avoid a fight and start making your way back to regroup with the rest of us. Now, Pato, I'd prefer to split your party between the 4 of us, but I'll respect your opinion if you take issue with it. They can all hold their own, he said as he cast a quick look their way, all of them nodding. Put them wherever you think would be best. All right, Tui with me, Buth with you, Galda with Thera, and Azizal with Ben. For the Chimera group, split yourself amongst each person and listen to the first rank with you as your active leader. Should you conclusively find any demons, tell them first before rushing in. With confirmation given, Thera looked at Ben as the rest began to divide themselves, worried about how things might turn out if she wasn't watching while he tried to reassure her. Relax. I can probably handle myself. Saying probably isn't the most reassuring. Well, if anything goes wrong on my end, I'll flicker bind to get your attention, he told her, rapidly turning the skill on and off for emphasis. You do the same if you have any issues. I'll come running. Okay. Sounds like a plan. They parted with that contingency made as her group gathered around her. Galda, who she'd already spoken to a bit, and 12 chimeras under her command, and despite herself, it brought a bit of excitement to the quest no matter how it turned out. It was at the very least something different compared to acting as a simple observer, and she waited for Phone to say anything else before she took control. I'll take north, Pato south, Thera east, and Ben west. All of you use your best judgment, and if you feel the need to turn around and regroup early for any reason, please do so. With that said, they all turned to go on their way, Thera walking behind the chimeras with Galda at her side. The two were still there to observe after all, though either would act if it came to it as they went on their way. After walking for a while, the main thing they noticed was just how quiet that stretch of woods was. It lacked the typical sounds of animals and life one might expect save for their own movements, at least to her ears, with Galda seeming in agreement. This is just like it was before we found that giant wall, she muttered, leaving Thera to try to keep from blushing as she reassured her. I'm sure this is unrelated. Demons can completely clear out any place they're in. If anything, I'd say this is a sign they're near. Speaking of, are any of you finding anything more than whatever signs are already surrounding us? Sounds, one spoke. Slight but there, though I'm not certain of what. In the direction we're heading, though. And you don't think they're demons? Not the way they usually seem, at least. All right. Well, tell me if you hear anything else. Getting a nod, they went on their way. The chimeras occasionally spoke up when the distant noise started or stopped. Changing their direction when they needed to, given that was the only thing they had to go off of so far, while she watched the world with her own senses, trying to feel any pounding of earth or tunneling nearby, or else looking for any nearby signs of life with her other skills, coming up empty each time. It was Galda who noticed something wrong first, speaking up for the rest of them. If we keep going this way, we'll have gone in a full circle soon. We're being led back the way we started. Everyone on guard. If they were being led, then that meant there was an intent behind it which pointed to the very targets they were hunting, but with the chimeras still not picking up on anything more definitive around them other than whatever subtle noise they were following. That meant the demons they were looking for had a level of skill that could outmatch whatever senses they held, with all of the danger that implied. With the fact that they could have been the ones outnumbered if they'd come across the entire group as well, that left only a single choice, turning back and finding the others once more, and she moved to the others to tell them just that, with the only questions left in her mind being if she should alert Ben and if she should take to the skies with those in her care to avoid the confines of the woods. But she never got to answer that. As if sensing the decision taking place in her head, a change came over her and the rest, with a weakness coming to her body faster than she could react and turning the world dark before she could so much as glimpse as whatever caused it. Ben wasn't used to leading, but given he had a dozen chimeras with him, he didn't need to be. It was still their task after all, with both himself and Azizal acting more as glorified guards as they went, watching as the group followed the occasional sound in an otherwise silent forest. He was keeping an eye out for problems, of course, more eyes than he actually had, as he kept pulling in and taking over the few nearby bugs to give himself a fuller range of vision, but unlike whatever strong senses a handful of the chimeras had, he held nothing that could point him to whatever it was they were hearing, even if he was feeling his concerns slowly grow as they went, with a map forming in his mind of their travels, telling him they were gently turning off their original course. Nothing that was an immediate problem, but one that gave a distinct feeling of being led. Everyone, keep an eye out, he told them. Something feels a bit off about all of this. What's the problem? Azizal wanted to know, not seeing anything herself, while Ben shook his head. Maybe nothing, but whatever noise we're following has been taking us off track in a pretty consistent way. I wouldn't expect our path to be going like this if whatever we were tailing didn't know we were here, and with how smoothly it's got us shifting our pace, either it's switching between darting off and slowing down, or we're actually being led by multiple things with some falling silent while others begin making noise to pull us along. And, no, I'm calling it. Everyone, turn around, we're going back. They'd been walking for a bit less than an hour, but he didn't care if they'd be getting back too early. The safety of the people around him was his priority, despite any other feelings on the topic that were making themselves known. Are you sure about this? Azizal asked. Without having seen anything yet, this is pretty quick to be giving up. And we want to prove ourselves, One of the chimeras spoke. Giving up in the face of adversity is dash. What your current leader has decided to do, Ben spoke firmly. If we're being led, then we're playing into something else's hands. A situation I refuse to let myself fall into. Everyone, fall back. We're finding the others and regrouping. If there really was a trap, then he wanted no part of it, and if he was wrong, then he couldn't care less. By being given the role of leading them, he'd been given their safety as well, and he had no intention of carelessly putting it on the line when they could instead enjoy the benefits that came with having their full numbers with them. If the others hadn't found anything, then they could collectively come together to explore that region, and if they had, then it was all the more reason to get back together. He could feel in the eyes and thoughts of the people around him that some didn't approve, but he didn't care, and he directed them to turn back the way they'd come, slowly making their way through the woods as he quietly spoke to the woman at his side. If you have something to say, then just say it. I don't. If you discover this tale on Amazon, be aware that it has been unlawfully taken from Royal Road. Please report it. I can feel your disapproval from here. Are you 3rd or 4th ranked? 3rd. Well, if I'm going to be honest with you, I'd say you probably have a lot more experience with this whole being an adventurer thing, but I have a firm rule about trying to make sure I live, and a bit of caution can be a decent key to that. The fact we haven't found anything else other than a few sounds is too worrying to keep going off when we're expecting to be outnumbered, at least as far as I'm concerned. I'm not going to argue with you, you're in charge. But if we can keep an eye out for any dead animals, I might be able to find something a bit more than what we've gotten. I've been looking this entire time, and there's been nothing which is worrying enough by itself. It wasn't like things wouldn't be quickly eaten in a forest, but he'd always been observant, and with the senses of a growing swarm of bugs also at his disposal, he'd thought he'd have been all the more so, but he kept coming up empty. Another worrying thing in all they were dealing with. There were of course plenty of things that could have caused that, even just a shift in the ecosystem, but he knew demons could clear out a land in its entirety. The emptiness around them seemed as sure a sign that their targets were around as the vague senses of the chimeras that were picking up their constant smells everywhere they went. Signs in an otherwise barren landscape. With any hint, they were anything but a lone absent, save for the sounds that were only growing more distant as they walked back to the safety of their group until a sudden change, freezing Ben and 3 of the chimeras in their place. What? Azizal asked as the rest of them stopped too, with Ben nodding ahead of them. That noise we were following before? Now it's in front of us. Everyone be prepared for a fight and proceed with caution. A couple eyes turned to the chimeras, who nodded, confirming what Ben had said since they were all unaware. He'd heard it through their heads before moving on. Far more carefully now that whatever danger there was sat in front of them as they moved to meet it, having no other choice if they wanted to regroup, as they all wondered about just what they were going to face until the sound stopped once more, with one of the chimeras sharing that fact with the rest of them. We're being toyed with. It matched the demons' personalities on that front at least. He knew they could be needlessly cruel to their targets and each other. But there was more that didn't immediately seem to fit. He didn't doubt that 1 or 2 demons could be sneaky enough to leave no traces. But a crowd of them? They were expecting to deal with hundreds, and while it seemed that such a group would obey a powerful enough leader if they had one, he still didn't think it would, to the point that they'd do anything so subtly. So what was the point? Unless they're still trying to hurt us. Shit. Everyone, keep going straight and pick up the pace. We aren't allowing whatever this is to decide the direction for us, so if it comes to it, be prepared for immediate combat. He tried to stretch out his already extended connect just a little farther, wanting to get the first sign of danger as quick as he could, even if he'd only gained himself milliseconds with whatever extra reach he'd managed as he pushed through, feeling all of the life in the dirt beneath their feet as well in case they were going to be attacked from below, as he started flickering Bind to tell Thera something was wrong. If things worked out, she'd pick up the rest of her group and dart towards them, but until then he just needed to make sure they'd all be okay, and he put his efforts into making it happen as they went until whatever had been hounding them either realized it wouldn't be getting what it wanted or else had managed to claim exactly that, as whatever it was doing changed. Not a sound, but a feeling of being touched. With nothing around them all, Ben felt something try to link up with both his and the rest of their minds. Stepping through the great gate to a new world, the first thing the demon tried to do was assemble itself before almost instantly dying. That gave it a slight pause. It had gone through to 2 unclaimed worlds before, one that already had an owner and one that didn't, but neither time in the past had it met its end so quickly. Perhaps that should have been a cause for concern when it hadn't even seen what had killed it, but it paid that fact no real mind, instead trying again, only to get the exact same result. Now that was a genuine problem. Twice it had died and twice it didn't know why, not even giving it enough time to glimpse the world its god would soon own. It pressed out more from there, trying to come out of the gate from different angles to see if it would have any success, but with each instant failure it had realized it had to accept a certain fact. Everything going through that particular gate was doomed. Supposedly such things happened on occasion. Its kind weren't ones who would casually chat, and what little language they'd held before they'd had a new tongue bond to them didn't make that any easier, but certain facts did spread, with that one forcing it to realize that it had to treat that planet with slightly more caution that the others it had personally watched fall, and it forced its way back through the network, ignoring the tens of thousands of others of its kind that were racing to their doom as it instead began looking at each of the remaining gates with a more critical eye, going through each one. It died at 3 more no matter what it did, marking that world as considerably more dangerous than what it was used to, with the rest having various levels of risk among the ones it could access. Though on different paths, he knew the aquatic members of its kind were claiming portions of that planet too, which left it a bit of curiosity if those gates were more or less safe, but ignored the question in the end. Of the nearly 160 paths left to it, there were 50 where it died often enough in its first 5 minutes out that it decided to ignore those options too for what dangers they held, narrowing the demon's choices down to whatever seemed the safest until its decision was made, and grabbing itself new limbs, went out to take the world for whatever food and strength it held. It raced out with the rest of its kind, following its instincts as it went while keeping its main eyes ahead. It died going straight, so instead it turned right, feeling its teeth rip through one of the world's current owners as it did when they stood in its way. It wasn't long after an attack killed some of its limbs, and while it considered taking a different path to avoid it, the further out from the gate it went the harder it was becoming to escape unscathed, with certain paths being revealed as safer the entire time it went despite what it viewed as the more sensible options. It could see that the farther out it went with all of the limbs it had gathered, the better its odds were of coming under fire, with the risk growing ever greater as it tried to gauge the optimal path for itself to travel. Giving them all up was a non-option. Even if it would have been safer in the short term, it would have been left practically blind as a result, but it appeared some trimming was necessary as it let bits of its collective flesh feel the bite of their waiting food's steel or spells. It could always gather more if need be, but itself, its core, was too valuable to allow to come to harm on something like that, and it continued to push through, killing the entire way. Unauthorized usage. This tale is on Amazon without the author's consent. Report any sightings. By the end, it was down to 12 limbs at its disposal, but that was more than enough. It had broken through, leaving the far simpler task of taking down any of the surrounding meals that had a bit too much fight in them. For those it stopped caring about safety, more than happy to overwhelm them and feel them squirm in its jaws as it went farther out into that new world. As with the last 2 worlds it had enjoyed, that one was a feast. The entire planet was full and ready to be consumed, waiting for it to delight in, while the new voice in its head occasionally spoke out at the growth of it or its limbs as the weeks went on, telling them they'd become something more. It was a feature he'd grown to relish in ever since it had appeared, feeling the strength that came with it each time it made itself known, and made the demon desire nothing more than to hear it again, driving its desire for growth, even as its path took it to easier meals and away from that new civilization as a whole. After all, just because it was ignoring the dominant species of the planet for the time didn't mean there wasn't still plenty to be enjoyed. There were fights to be had and flesh to eat among the dumber bits of wildlife as it grew its strength after years of starvation, preparing to take on the rest of the world, whether that meant slaying its natives or its own kind. And there were other reasons to go out beyond the bounds of whatever civilization was trying to fight against its god's will as well. It had hoped it might gain some stronger limbs than what it currently had out in the wilds, even if what it had found had been largely lacking and implied that it had made a mistake in that part of its journey. But in the end it didn't matter. There would always be more, and as its kin cleared the planet, the demon would take anything worthwhile that was left. With a goal in mind, there was plenty of time before it needed to get to it, time to grow its strength before too many more of its kind would arrive, but it found a new group of prey entering its domain sooner than expected. It had happened before, of course, and like the last times, it had sent some limbs out to handle it, only to see them die. That surprised it enough that it held them back instead as it looked at the new group once more, feeling all of the paths their existences created. There were many, too many. The more there were, the more options there were to be had. That had always been true, but a group like that shouldn't have been able to create so many for themselves, and with how its limbs died along so many of those paths, it told the demon that the new limbs it so desired may have just fallen into its lap. It watched longer, seeing as they eventually split up before taking them for itself, feeling as the area it encompassed grew when it took them in before focusing on the final ones. Still too many paths were being made, showing it that it was a member of that last crowd that had been responsible and only made the demon want them more. While it had already found great power in the others it had claimed, the potential one of them must have held had to have been enormous in a way that was irresistible, with only one issue. No matter what it did, no matter what path it walked, it couldn't take them. That created the problem as to why, with the answer unseen no matter how many paths it looked down. But just because it couldn't in the moment didn't mean it wouldn't be able to figure it out later. They were trapped and alone with it, and it knew it was far greater than them. So despite already having seen how it would turn out, it reached forth to take them all, only to feel something it hadn't been prepared for as something else reached back. It was so brief that Ben wasn't even sure what he'd felt. In one moment, something had either been touching his thoughts or his soul, but the instant he'd turned his attention towards it, trying to peer back, he felt the link break under the weight of his mind. Whatever it was completely unprepared for the power it found, with only the smallest bit of feeling being read before it was cut. That was enough, though, telling him exactly what had just tried to make contact from the hunger and bloodlust that had slipped through. Hey, any of you feel that? Feel what? Okay. I guess I really broke that way too fast. A demon just tried to do something to us. Not really sure what, but since I usually consider having my mind or soul attacked in some way a bad thing, we're going to assume we're in constant danger here. Chimera group? Is there anything nearby? Not that we can tell. Okay. I'm officially marking us down as being in extreme danger, so start moving and stick close to me. We need to find the others as fast as possible. Ben, if the chimeras couldn't feel anything, what makes you so sure we've just been attacked? Azizal asked him, even if she followed along with him as he rushed to find Thera through their shared skill. Their senses seem exceptional. Are you sure you're not just on edge? I didn't bring it up because it didn't seem relevant, but I have a pretty handy mastery of some mind and soul skills too. Trust me here, something just tried something on us in a way I was not expecting to deal with. Now, myriad, answer me. Would you? Silence, with the rest of his group wondering what he was going on about until he tried again, wanting his god's attention. Myriad, you really can be unavailable in the most inconvenient times, you know that? Your precious apostle seems to have stumbled into an issue and could use some eyes in the sky. If this isn't a code red, then I'd at least say it's yellow, maybe even orange. It's at a place where I could use some backup. More silence, only with eyes drawn to him now that he'd named himself as an apostle. With the others he was with looking at him with questions he had no intention of answering as he kept trying. Nair? Helori? Analia? Anyone? Come on. I don't really need your guys' attention, just tell my angular buddy I could use a hand. Goddamn. If nobody is answering, does that mean you're all in some stupid meeting again? Very inconvenient that all the world's gods can just become unreachable at random times. We're seriously going to have to talk about that eventually. He devoted a large portion of the thoughts in his head to trying to get the attention of whatever god he could and kept it up as he kept moving, hoping it would be annoying enough that at least one would stop to check what the problem was as he rushed them all through the woods, eventually making it back to where they'd started. Unauthorized use of content. If you find this story on Amazon, report the violation. Alright, now that we're here, what do you guys think about the prospect of meeting up with another group? He asked, more worry forming in him by the second. He was still flickering bind, and there was no way it hadn't gotten Thera's attention. The fact that she hadn't met them yet spoke of a problem on her end. Either she was being held up by something that didn't leave her feeling the need to alert him about, or she was unconscious and couldn't react, which only made him want to go to her sooner, even if he needed to play it smart. If she of all people was in trouble and one of the other groups was close enough, then it would make more sense to go together. That wasn't the answer he got though, as a few shook their heads. We can follow the paths they took, but there's no sign they're on their way back yet. At least not close enough to notice. We are rather early. Okay, that's the opposite of ideal, but for now follow me. I have reason to believe Thera's group is in danger, so be prepared for the worst. And before any of you ask, I have a skill I share with her that she's not reacting to, but the fact I can still use it tells me she's alive, which is a good sign for the rest of them too. He answered the questions forming in some minds before it could be spoken while he moved them along, trying not to make them outright run in those unfamiliar woods but keeping a quick enough pace that Azizal, with her unmodified body and lower attributes, was beginning to sweat. He had his priorities though, and they weren't going to change for anyone's comfort when he was so lacking in his own. While he knew whatever had been attempted on them had to do with either their minds or souls based on what he had felt, the fact that demons were natural soul users made which option he viewed as more likely obvious, while also creating a range as to what could have been attempted on them or done to Thera, even if he didn't know what the limits of it were. It wasn't like he couldn't have guessed, but to the average people of the world, soul magic was a third-tier skill. Before the birth of the demidemons, no other groups had weaker variants of it, meaning most of the study on how it could be used was restricted to the few that had been created in the past. Add in the fact that its main means of use at that point beyond the life or death it would grow from was to help grow others, and that meant there was plenty of room for spells to exist that he wasn't aware of. At the very least, the safest and most efficient spell for dealing with enemies hadn't been employed for the simple fact that Thera was alive. Usually, if a soul mage needed to, they could practically erase a target or group of targets' vitality without breaking a sweat. As long as they weren't dealing with the worst result, then he had to try and be optimistic, with that feeling getting easier once he finally got a response. Ages, are you able to mute me or something up there? You absolute bitch. Okay, we're talking about this later. For now, something's gone wrong with our third hunt, and I'm honestly not super clear as to what, but some hidden demon tried to use either a mind or soul effect on us, and Thera hasn't been responding to me since I've been trying to alert her. I can still feel bind though, so she should be straight ahead in the direction I'm running. Can you please do me a favor and check her condition so I can see what I'm running into? His god gave no argument, lifting a weight from Ben's mind as he and the others kept going, trying to close the distance as much as he could before his god spoke once more. He didn't get to hear whatever else Myriad was going to say, but he was able to make a rough guess easily enough. Before he knew it, they were in a small break in the woods, just large enough to give him a clear view of the chimeras standing lined up with Galda, as if ready to greet them, while Thera floated gently in the air and waiting, a nearly serene look on her face that left only a single thought going through his head. Oh damn, we're all going to die. Too far away for Ben to read any of their minds. It didn't matter as he looked at his girlfriend, floating above them. Even before they'd started dating, he'd been told he was unusually good at understanding the subtleties of her expressions and features, despite her golden eyes making it a challenge for even her family at times, and seeing her there, it was undeniably the woman he loved. Not a construct or illusion, that was Thera in every way, but the look on her face, distinctly out of place compared to everything else he was seeing, that told him that even if she was right in front of him in every way that mattered, he wasn't facing her. Therein lied the problem. If that really was Thera, but she wasn't in control, her mind and soul dominated by the same attempt that had been made on himself, then that implied the thing that had her also had access to her insane pool of mana, leaving it ready to be used against them. That also meant the others around her were no longer in control of themselves either, but that was basically ignorable in comparison. As strong as they were, Ben was sure he could have either handled and subdued or at the very least escaped from the rest of them if it came down to it, but she was different. If it meant a fight, then he'd be putting his life on the line and one of them was going to die, an unacceptable result that led to a different choice. With time at a standstill, he wove his thoughts deeper into the connection he was already keeping up among the others and giving both an order and a desire to follow it before they even understood what was happening. Run. He already had their feet moving for them, not choosing forward or back but off to the left, since the path seemed more clear before they could understand they hadn't moved through their own will, with that changing at the first sign of reaction from Thera and her group. They could hear the pounding of feet behind them, and through the eyes of his swarm of bugs, he could see an arrow fired by Galda aimed for him in particular that left him stuck deciding if he should take the hit. It was aimed at his legs, and he'd designed his pants to be better than any armor, Galda shouldn't have had the strength or quality of weapon to break through them to bring him to the ground, but the fact that something was controlling her created an unknown variable as to how much damage he might actually receive. There had been too many times in the past he'd encountered attacks that had bypassed his designs, and he couldn't judge through what little mana sense the insects he'd bound to him possessed when they were his eyes on the coming blow. In the end, he tried to split the difference. Dodging faster than an arrow could fly would put undue strain on his body, and letting it be a clean hit would have been too much risk to one of the limbs currently carrying him, so instead he gently shifted his weight, not wanting the archer to hit her mark and changing it to a glancing blow. He was prepared to feel it cut through his flesh and the sting that would follow, an undeniably unpleasant attack but one he could deal with, but he never got it. The arrow hit and he felt a dull thud, but his pants did their job and it slid past to sink into the dirt. That attack done while he waited for something far worse. Thera still hadn't done anything. He was expecting some burst of earth magic that wasn't coming, and it was keeping him on edge as he tried to imagine any way he could possibly deal with whatever attacks she would throw, powerlessly left in waiting for it to come. What are the odds she saw my face and the power of love broke her free from her mind control? That could happen, right? He didn't believe it for a second, no matter how much he wanted to, and soon enough his pessimism was proven true in a way he was less prepared for. While Thera was half Earth Spirit and had been focusing on her life magic recently, it wasn't like that was all she had after all, and immediately walls of mana went up, splitting their group to divide them and leaving 6 of the chimeras to end up outside of his range, hurting them just slightly too far away as they ran, breaking their connection to him and creating room for her next attack as she held forth her staff and used a power that came more naturally than any other, casting out he charm to bring them under her thrall. It affected the ones with him as well, but at that point he took them over in full, becoming each of his remaining 7 party members as he ran with all he had, using one of his chimeric bodies to pick up Azizal as they rushed away, since he could feel her body reaching its limits in a way the others weren't, just in time for the next attack. This time the expected earth magic came into play as Ben strained his minds. Feeling the potential in each body, he held as the ground beneath their feet shot up to try and ensnare them, forcing him to contort himself and all he occupied to avoid the various strikes while he shot out his own magic where he could to break up some of the incoming attacks, watching as they crumbled when his precision met overwhelming power in a way that let him feel just a bit of hope they'd have a chance to get away, until it was near instantly dashed by the sight of a familiar face. If you spot this narrative on Amazon, know that it has been stolen. Report the violation. Pato arrived, appearing in an empty space in front of them, and Ben had no doubt in his mind that despite how little he knew the other, he'd been conquered too. There was some subtlety in the movement that betrayed the fact that the one using it didn't know how to handle the body they held, and he was proven right as the man reached out to cast his magic in front of them, forcing Ben to use every bit of his mana sense to try and judge the scope of the forming attack before he dodged forward, trying to break the distance between them. 4 of the remaining chimeras vanished. Whether they were even alive he couldn't say, and left only himself, Azizal, and 2 others as Ben tried his best to improve their odds by getting Pato into his range, only to see the man disappear mere feet from him, being close enough to connect and forcing them to continue to run, even as questions filled his mind. Why did whatever held Pato force him to retreat? He understood that something was using them and likely had access to their minds and memories to some extent as a result, but he hadn't told the other summoned about that power he held. So did it come from Thera's memories? Had the demon or demons already read what she knew so thoroughly and prepared for him as a result? Given the way they'd used her magic, it seemed unlikely. As difficult as it had already been to escape from, the way it was cast spoke of someone who was still trying to figure out how to apply it, doing simple things with the power it now held. But then, just because I can think of a million ways to trap us with her power doesn't mean whatever has her can, or that even she can. She knows a lot of spells at this point, but in general, she's pretty straightforward with how she uses her options. Maybe those attacks were a result of that. But even then, I think they could have done something more effective, so what does that mean? It means I don't have enough information. Okay, step 1, get away. Step 2, figure everything else out. Step 3, save her and hopefully everyone else, and maybe try to kill the demons doing this too. Alright, plan formed. Myriad, tell me you're still watching as I run for my life. Okay, cool. Then you've seen things have turned cataclysmically bad. I'm officially upping the threat level from yellow to red. So do you have any advice on how to get out of this? How surrounded are we talking? I'm sorry, what? I don't see any. Hell, I haven't accidentally connected to any either. Strange how? What? As unlikely as it was, Ben could imagine that they'd somehow come across a group of demons who were all unusually proficient in time magic, even if there were a few major issues with that assumption. It would be unlikely but possible. Thera, though, didn't remotely have the affinity for that one. With only a single point of potential to it, it was by all accounts a magic she would never be able to wield no matter what she did, meaning that if she was getting any benefits from it, it had to be through the one controlling her. But that doesn't make sense either. He thought to himself as he continued to dodge and try to escape all oncoming attacks without losing even more of his group. Prophecy is literally the least useful aspect of time magic in day-to-day life. Why would everything be using it on such a large scale? From all of his reading, Ben was an expert on the subject and knew that simply wasn't a way the magic was generally used for any number of good reasons. The mana cost for one, the strain for another, and then also just the sheer number of potential futures that existed. Everyone made choices every day, from the wisest in the world to the humblest of insects, and all of that would knit together into a dense tapestry of potential. There was a reason that there were so few groups on the planet who dedicated themselves to it, and why of those, they tended to focus on identifying broad things like storms and disasters or the results of harvest seasons. It was such a difficult and annoying branch of the magic to try and take advantage of that even the world's time gods, beings who by all accounts were the greatest masters of the power, had given a range of multiple years when using their skill to try and predict when the invasion was going to begin. The farther out one looked and the more specific the thing one looked for, the harder it was to find and the greater the cost would be. That may have made it sound like it would be easier to do on the short term, like what he was currently going through, but that was wrong too. If he had 100 choices in front of him, then he had 100 potential futures to take advantage of, and anyone looking at all of them during a fight needed to process not only which one he'd actually choose, but also keep track of what he was doing as it examined those choices. It was practically a recipe for leaving oneself open to attack. Of course, in general, some futures are just more likely than others. Is that how the demons have been hiding then? They've been following the futures that let them just casually avoid us, and every future where I get close enough to connect to one they get found, so they move before that can happen. Okay, this is bad, but now that I know, it's not insurmountable. Myriad. Give me a rundown of all of the demons in my surrounding area as fast as possible. Me finding out how they're tracking us was their worst bit of luck they could have had. I'm gonna see how many futures they can handle. Despite what he may have had to say about it, Ben's mind was no longer human. Existing at a scope great enough to shock the gods who'd seen it and growing only more alien with every living being his soul touched, potential existed within it that rarely needed to be used unless he was trying to solve a particularly complex problem. Certainly not the sort of potential that would normally go towards running away, but with the current issue at hand, he stopped a few of the background tasks some were on to take half of his minds, forcing each one to think of how to escape. With a total of 4,990 in his head, that didn't mean he was only coming up with half that many ideas though. Even a single mind he held had grown in strength beyond what a normal person could ever hope to expect, awakening the skill not only boosting his total number of minds but also the strands that made them up, bringing it from the normal 3 or 4 individual thoughts a person might be able to carry at a time to well over 100 now that he'd reached the final wall of the skill, and all of them were directed to looking at different ways he might escape the current situation. Willing to accept any option no matter how ludicrous, and that in itself helped create easier paths for him as every one of those ideas created a possible future he could go down, exploding the total number of options that whatever prophets the demons held would have to choose from. His god said in his head, "Then all that's left is picking a future. Myriad, give me a number between 1 and 250,000. 1. I ask you for something in the range of hundreds of thousands of options and you pick the very first? Fine, whatever. I just want you to know you're a terrible random number generator. I know how probability works, Myriad. I just also know that you didn't do a whole lot of soul-searching when you gave me that answer. Next time, take it slightly more seriously, since is my life on the line, or are they just trying to capture me to make another attempt at taking me over? The attacks so far haven't been anywhere near as lethal as they could have been if the aim was to kill us. I already am." Even during that back and forth, he'd begun his first potential plan, one that was admittedly among the most straightforward with how low it was on the list as he actualized bullets and tried to fire them off in directions Myriad said there were demons in hiding, feeling the strain as each hit something while he changed his directions by taking a sharp angle right. Cool, now give me another number. You're a bastard. Ugh, whatever. Any chance you could grab Hellori? I feel like there's a chance she'll take number picking slightly more seriously. Thanks. As they spoke, he began his next moves, activating the barriers within his shoes he'd placed to boost his speed during his escape from the demon world and putting them to use in a different way, using them to help increase the height of his jump instead of pushing him forward faster and bringing him to the tree branches while he propelled the chimeras with their natural strength, once more actualizing behind him but in a way that lacked any inherent meaning, trying to create things that might draw curiosity or wariness from whatever demons were gauging things as they came face to face with structures that held no mana while popping in and out of existence for seemingly no reason, with his hope being that the demons would assume they were being set up to act beyond whatever limits their prophecy held. Stolen from its rightful author, this tale is not meant to be on Amazon. Report any sightings. While running through the tree branches, he continued to strain his mind, feeling and controlling the way every individual muscle in his body and the others he was controlling moved while pushing his balance enhancement to its limits to make sure he wouldn't fall, strengthening the branches with his magic, as well at any place they seemed they might break until after a while he did the opposite, letting one snap to bring them back to the ground in a way that surely would have looked like an accident to any outside observer by the time Hellori joined in his head. That's cool, we can worry about the implications of that in a bit, but for now, give me a number between 1 and 250,000. What the hell are you guys doing? You spun the... Did you seriously actualize a wheel to pick? Wait, then was Myriad being serious when he was talking about rolling dice? Was that not just a turn of phrase? How? Hellori told him in a way that left him hearing the shrug in her voice. It's not a passive skill, and if I find out that's true, I'm just giving up and letting a demon eat me. At least after the last 2 times he tried to do a better job of randomizing the difficulty of the order, and he used his surrounding swarm of bugs to look behind him for what followers he still had, seeing that at some point it was still largely the people he'd come out there with whatever demon held them able to see through all of the possibility he'd created that no matter what, he wasn't going to hurt them if he could help it. Worse though was that Thera was still on their heels, warping the earth around them while firing constructs of magic since the dark aspects of her power weren't going to work on the few that were left. Seeing her there made him question if he really wanted to go with the option Hellori picked for them, but there was no other choice. The purpose of creating such random options was to create more futures than what the demons would be able to evaluate, and carrying on with that he actualized a single bullet, not worrying about getting it correct to the molecular level since that had a greater risk of hurting him than anything else, and instead left it hollowed out to act as both a container and barrier for what he really wanted delivered, shooting it at the ground behind them and letting the mental construct come down, exposing what he'd materialized to the world. That same instant an explosion rang out, throwing them forward and their pursuers back while filling the air with dust and debris to block the view all around them as he landed on all of his feet and continued running despite his ringing ears and hot back, earning him the screams of the gods. A quick look through the eyes of his few surviving bugs told him the second comment was true, with the heat he was feeling being some of the dirt that hadn't quite been vaporized in the blow to sting the skin of his neck and burn the back of his head in a way his companions had largely escaped from, and he quickly materialized some water to put it out before addressing the first shout. Yeah, I needed to fill out my options, which included making some risky ones. I want to say, though, when I put it at number 1, I wasn't expecting it to actually get picked. Hellori yelled back while he focused on materializing a variety of molecules in the air around them to try and mask their scent. Relax, I did my best to calculate how that would turn out, and it looks like I was mostly right. No planets destroyed and presumably nobody dead on either side? Myriad's side. Now I figure out how many demons are responsible for taking them over and then work to kill them and free the rest, so I'm going to need to get some help. Stick around. This is going to be a busy day for all of us. Continuing to run but trying to keep it as quiet as he could, Ben used the time to think about what he knew and what it implied. There were demons who could take over others, and those same demons were time magic users. Both of those facts seemed true, with the only matter being how many there were who held those skills, especially considering that Hellori believed awakened skills were at use in the mix. Given what he knew of how the invasion took place, there shouldn't have been any awakened skill holders who'd come through the last gate, but given there were at least 100 demons experiencing the benefits of prophecy, then that meant it couldn't just be one or two of them. So what did that imply happened? Did a group of awakened break their self-imposed rules and come through, or did more than a few just so happen to awaken the same skills in the weeks they'd been there? Or maybe it's just the particular skills that have been awakened. I've been assuming that soul magic is the bit that's being used to take it over, but it is in essence something acting the same way as hive mind. Okay, better than hive mind since it doesn't have the same limitations of only being available within the range I can connect to others. Ugh, stupid demons and their decent affinities for life and death. They could absolutely have some other soul-based skill helping them that awakened instead. And who's to say it has to be a group of awakened pulling this off? If whichever one managed to awaken whatever weird soul skill this is and found another that awakened their time magic, then maybe the first got control of the latter and has been able to apply their effects to everything in the group of demons it gathered. It's a working theory at least, but I'm going to need to try and confirm it somehow. But later. First thing first, let's get a little farther away. Distance was the most important thing to get, and he wanted it in spades. Running as fast as he could while also observing the Chimera's performance on a deeper level now that he was using their bodies as his own. With his awakened attributes, the only thing they beat him on was speed, but overall their performance was excellent. The exact sort of thing that would be powerful in a fight, even if his curiosity was pulling him away from that and in a different direction. Since coming back, there hadn't been much opportunity to experiment with hive mind. It was a skill that was essentially illegal for him to use in all but the lightest touches after all, with the only reason he was still keeping it up being that the other three would still be under the lingering effects of Thera's charm if he didn't. But it was the way Thera had been taken over that tempted him to try something. Could he force them to cast spells? He had control of their minds and bodies, but did that mean he also had power over their souls? With how much danger they were in, it was worth asking for the help it could bring, and he looked at the skills each held before making any attempt. While Azizal had her corpse song, she held an affinity magic too in the form of light magic, likely not bothering to mention it during their initial meeting because it was only at the first level, and the two chimeras had a few options between them as well. The first of the remaining, by the name of Juiz, held both fire and water at the first level, not out of any desire to be a proper mage, but instead to use in what had been his main profession as a cook before the invasion, while the second, Kaimit, held an air magic at the second level she'd developed largely in part to let her make a cool breeze for herself in the equatorial city she'd grown up in. All of them were too weak to be of much practical use, and mana quantity hadn't been something Vividus's alteration would affect, but they were options to consider, and he immediately tried to take advantage of them, using one to create a breeze to cool them down as they ran while another pulled some water from the air, and feeling both attempts work, with a success that would have had him beaming if not for the situation they were in. It wasn't something he'd be able to use often. There were few situations where he'd be legally allowed to do it at all, but he now held a method that would let his vast magic knowledge be applied to something other than just his enchanting, and he immediately put it into practice as he took advantage of the light magic Azizal held to both heal their wounds and buff them as best as he could, finding a different limit to his skill. This story has been stolen from Royal Road. If you read it on Amazon, please report it. Using their magic pulled from their pools, not an inherent problem since he could give some of his own over, but still something to be aware of, with the additional issue being that he was limited by their level of skill. He knew up to and including what a third-tier light magic was capable of, but he was playing with significantly lower limits no matter how much power he could shove into any of them to get it. Still, they moved quicker and their wounds healed, letting them get the distance he wanted just a little faster as the hours wore on. It was long after night had fallen that he finally stopped, with Myriad and Helori telling him they'd be relatively safe where he had ended up as he let himself fall to the ground. Even with some light magic at his disposal, that really did end up as more helpful to the others than himself, with his body still as incompatible with such a low level of power as ever, and he took his time catching his breath while he rubbed his sore legs. He'd gotten his distance, but if they wanted them, he didn't know how long it would last when, just as importantly, he was going to need to go back anyway. All he'd claimed for himself was some breathing room, and once he'd caught his breath, he finally released the hold he had on the others' minds, freeing them as the remaining three of his group looked around in confusion. What happened? Azizal asked, her head darting around as she took in the fact that not only were they in a different section of the woods entirely but also had lost hours of the day. Have we been captured? No. Long story short, it looks like there's probably a couple awakened demons in this group, at least one of whom was able to take control of the rest of our group, including Thera. Now, you guys didn't really get the chance to see how powerful she is, but we'll leave it at overwhelmingly so for now, and they tried to use her to cast a dark spell on you all. I'm immune to mind attacks though, so I got us to run away, and now we're safely here, and while it is actually significantly more complicated than anything I just described, I'll give you the long version while we eat. His body was craving any sort of nutrient by that point, and he could tell from the connection he'd had with the others for so long that they felt the same, even if they were trying to keep focused on the emergency at hand, so he pulled some supplies from his rings to hand them out to eat. He'd rather have cooked but didn't want to draw any more attention to them that a fire could have brought, so they made their way through the dried goods and water he had as they listened to the full story of what happened, all chewing, stopping by the end. "You took us over the same way the demons did?" Juiz asked, looking horrified while Ben shrugged. "It was that, or abandon you since the moment you were charmed you became nothing but a liability. Of course, while I'd like to think that being taken over by myself is a bit better than having it done by a demon, if you're not happy with it you're free to go to one of them instead." "Ignore him," K-Mit said. "Thank you for saving us, and so what now? Now we're trapped alone so deep in the woods that I don't know how many days or weeks it would take to get out without a space mage to use, and frankly, I wouldn't even try without having Thera with me, so here's what's going to happen. Everyone get some rest. I'll wake you all in a couple hours. From there, we're finding ourselves a demon to extract as much information from as possible. Once we have that, then we'll evaluate and decide what to do again from there." "And how are we finding a demon if they can predict where we're going to be?" Azizal asked. "That sounds like a good way to end up in a trap." "There's no way they can look too far into the future," Ben told them. "It has to be at a scale of minutes at most, otherwise the branching potential paths would get too thick and complex for anything to figure out on such a minute level. With that being the case, we have options, and I have my eyes in the sky looking for the best one we can take, so for now, don't worry and get what rest you can. There isn't going to be time for much of that until this is done." Once the others had slept for a while as he kept guard, he woke them up and started moving, following the directions Myriad and Hellori had given them. He'd asked the gods to find as distant a demon they could, one separated from the rest of the group, that they'd have at least a few minutes to get to it before it could go out, and get some help in the hopes they'd be able to trap it so Ben could read its mind and memories for all that was worth. All to find whatever clue he could get as to the ones who were pulling the strings as they made their way over. This time they were the hunters, keeping stealthy as they approached their target as the gods watched its every movement. The stray demon that was searching the perimeter, completely unaware of their presence still until its future solidified and it saw one where it was chased and trapped, unable to escape. Its hunters were too powerful and help was too far away, as the one that controlled it made the only choice it could, not knowing the gods of the world were watching as it happened. Myriad spoke, sounding defeated. The connection broken with the touch of a mind. The demon jerked from where it sat in surprise. It had already known it wouldn't work, but it hadn't realized the feeling that came with it. A feeling of being seen, exposed in a way it had never been before, and it looked at all of the paths the act had created while it processed what had happened. Something had broken its link. It had been ages since such a thing had happened, but never in such a way before, and thinking about it made it feel like its own futures had diverged. Should it run? Should it kill that final group and be content with the power it had already claimed, or should it face them down to overcome whatever it was it had just touched in an attempt to win in the end? Its desire was to live, same as all things, and while it valued safety to an extent perhaps abnormal for its kind, it also desired power and knew it was its god's desire it achieved it. What it was facing with that group was a challenge, but perhaps one that would let it grow into something more than it currently was, or failing that, at least earn it a new limb that could put it on that path to power. So no, it wouldn't run and it wouldn't kill them, not yet. Instead, it continued to watch from a distance as that group moved, with a realization coming to it as they did. Those creatures were coming for its newest limbs. Considering they'd originally been part of the same group, perhaps it wasn't surprising they had some way to find them through the dense woods, but as it looked at the paths it might take itself, it decided to wait and see, letting the two groups meet to try and close them in. a task that was still far harder than it had expected. The limbs it held were some of the most powerful it had ever gained, with one possessing what felt like a near-limitless supply of mana. Given time to master that power, the demon felt like it would be able to conquer that world by itself, but the key was that it needed time. There was only so much it would be able to do with that power by the time the final group appeared, and with no path it could see leading to their immediate capture, all it could do was follow the ones that looked the most likely to eventually lead to success. Which began with trying to hobble the one the demon thought was creating so many futures, using one of his new limbs to fire an arrow, only for it to nearly become sick with the amount of potential created as its target reacted to that single shot. It hadn't been that many when it had first looked ahead, only split between the most likely probabilities, but when the actual shot had been fired, that had changed. It knew before it attacked that it was never going to succeed, but the second that arrow was released, the demon felt the future around it fracture into 1,000 more pieces, each of them subtle variations of just where its target intended to take the hit or how to dodge away, with each of them leading to different reactions that would carry forth a tangled bush of probability that collapsed once the attack hit and casually slid past into the ground, leaving it to reel. The magic it used to see the world had its limits, but one of the bigger ones was paths splitting unexpectedly. It wasn't something it had to deal with often, and when it did it was still typically in a manageable range of a handful of new potentials at most, but what it had just gone through was far beyond that. It was looking at a target that could potentially radically alter its own future. That told the demon two things, though. The one it had shot at was almost certainly the one that had blocked it from taking the rest of them, and more important than that, it told it of the potential that existed within that target. There was danger to be had from anything that could so casually create more paths to walk, but that was nothing compared to what it would be able to get from that target should it be able to make it a limb. Any time in the past it had taken one for itself, it had always opened up options that had never existed before, and what it was seeing implied an endless swath of them so long as it could only make that fleeing beast its own. This story originates from Royal Road. Ensure the author gets the support they deserve by reading it there. It was knowledge that led to the next attempt of splitting the final group, one it could already see a successful path for as it brought up walls between them to divide them up as they fled, confirming once more that the ones around it were less valuable, even if the demon still took them for itself once they were out of whatever range the strange fleshy creature needed to protect them. Even if it could only see so far, it knew that having them would create more options for it when they each held so much power, and it refused to lose out on that bit of potential either, even if they weren't the prize. With that first success, it carried on its attacks with its new limb, seeing all of them fail before they went off but not despairing. All of it was to herd the group it wanted and also gave the demon practice with using those magics. Some of its other limbs had held them in the past, but not with the level of skill or power its newest one possessed, and in that practice one of its other new options arrived, wielding its space magic while the demon continued to look for a better path, only managing to snag a few more from the group without getting its true target and feeling its frustration growing. Long had it been since it struggled so much to get something it desired, and it was feeling its efforts fail the longer things went on, even as it told itself that it was not but a matter of time. A little longer, just beyond the paths it could see laid its victory, with that belief shaking too soon after as potential paths split once more. Not like the last time, though. No, hundreds of new options would have been negligible in comparison, as hundreds of thousands of paths were made with each one splitting just as much, more than a few weaving back into each other but creating an overwhelming volume for it to sort through as it tried to measure probabilities and coming up lacking. A path was picked and even more sprouted, another was picked and more went on as potential was forged and collapsed repeatedly in a way that was too much to keep up with until it no longer had to. An attack shot from some of the most unlikely paths. Its limbs were injured and targets lost as they got away. Hours later, and it was still reeling from the loss. Torn between the potential limbs it had lost the chance to get with all of the power it could have claimed from them against the danger such a thing was to it. It couldn't imagine anything beyond a god being able to create so many paths, which made the demon want to take the creature for its own all of the more, but it knew that trying would carry risks far beyond what it would normally want to take in exchange for those rewards. But wouldn't the risk be worth it? It had been sent to grow, that was the desire of its great god as well, and even if it somehow failed to dominate the other, it would most certainly be the sort of challenge it needed to break beyond its wall to greater heights. An opportunity that seemed lost to it as well at first. vanished in the endless woods and from the sight of any of its paths as it sat until one distant limb found something. Catching sight of them, that single one was outnumbered and captured, whatever it went through unknown to it but left the group it was hunting to turn from where they were and focus in on its exact direction. A shudder went through it and it clipped away that path, killing the limb they would have found to make sure that would never come to pass and letting violent glee course through it. Whatever they had done, they wouldn't be finding it so easily now, but the demon knew where they'd be. It just had to go out and get them. Killed itself? Ben repeated, pinching his brow. Myriad, how far out from it are we? That was the main issue. Even though his goal of reading its memories had been lost, they weren't actually out of options, but assuming they had no reason to speed up, that meant whatever was pulling the strings could potentially see up to 6 minutes in the future. That was an outrageous amount when gauging something as specific as how a group might attack it, far above his worst estimates. If they were dealing with an Awakened Time magic user, then he was assuming they were dealing with something that had an advanced variant of the magic instead of just the standard high version, but even then he'd been prepared for at worst 3 minutes of precognition. 6 was an eternity that pointed to a far more worrying sign. Unless it had a combination of time skills helping it and an Awakened Time magic variant as out of the norm for that affinity as his unnatural mind was when compared against other mind skills, that meant the thing they were facing hadn't just awakened their time magic, it had leveled it. But that's impossible. I know I can't exactly be one to judge, but I have the benefit of a pile of jobs and blessings to go with any natural talent I might have for my skills. The only benefit this thing would have is the structure given by the job system. There's no way it managed to awaken its magic and then also level it a few times in the 2 months it could have been here. Hell, that's 2 months if it got through on the first day. This has to be something else. Did the one able to control others snag one of this world's Awakened Time mages then? God, if they're this good at it, then I'd be expecting someone on the level of a contender, but I feel like I would have heard about someone like that going missing, so what is it? I guess it's possible they got someone with an already high awakened variant and then they got a level after they were taken over, but no, there's too much I don't know, let's hurry up and get answers. Pick up the pace, we're moving, Ben told his group as he activated his shoes to propel him forward with each step he took, feeling them throw him through the air and giving him a burst of speed beyond what he'd ever normally manage as the other 3 did their best to keep up. By all accounts, he could at least say that no matter how far into the future their enemies could see, they'd made a mistake in how they'd done things. They'd made a choice by having that demon kill itself that in turn selected the future Ben would choose to follow, creating results beyond whatever it could predict, even if it created a new danger for them as well. He had no doubt that they'd been found, with more things coming their way. The fact they hadn't seen fit to use Pado to help the creature escape was their blessing, and one he was going to take advantage of for all it was worth by the time they reached the corpse, nodding to Azizal as they did. You're up. Push your skill to the limit, 'cause I don't know if we're going to get another shot at this. She knelt down by it without a word with the order given and began using her magic while Ben connected to her, seeing in her mind as it activated to reveal the life of the demon, with an unexpected mana requirement behind it. Corpse Song was a magic that let the user see a body's history. With a higher mana cost, the farther one wanted to look back, that would only be increased with the age of the body it was acting on, but the price was already well beyond what anyone had expected as her mana drained due to the intense weight of experience. Reading on Amazon or a pirate site. This novel is from Royal Road. Support the author by reading it there. She wasn't just seeing the past as she used it, through the power that had been at play the entire time. She was also forced to feed her mana to see all of the potential futures it had looked through in its last hours, creating so much more for her to process and try to work through because of it. But mana wasn't a problem when Ben had thousands. When he felt her start to struggle, he began feeding her his own to keep her spell running, watching everything as it passed through her mind and interpreting it the best he could while pressing her to keep looking back farther in the past, looking for one key thing and eventually getting it as they were lead to that demonic group's lair. With more answers too, all of them giving him a headache as he was forced to toss aside so many of his theories in the face of what he was experiencing. The demon in control, for it was by all appearances only one, seemed to have mastered both soul and time magic to an extent that it was responsible for both effects he'd seen in his companions and the swarms that roamed the forest, with everything that implied ringing clear as well. It held 2 awakened skills and by all accounts at high levels. Something no demon that had just come to the world should have had, but he didn't know what that meant. Was it some genius that was flying through its levels after making its way to the world? It was possible it had somehow gotten its hands on a job crystal and had found some way to cheat the system the same way he had to speed through it. That could have potentially helped it gain whatever growth it had. Or maybe it had been another observer who had gotten itself stranded when the first wave ended early. The gods had told him it was only the one before, but it wasn't like they were never wrong. Who was to say one more hadn't managed to slip through? Both would be bad, but neither was what he considered the worst option, even if he tried not to focus on something else. It didn't matter when it had gotten them. The monster had high-leveled awakened skills. What did matter was how it was using them. He was now convinced that the way the demon was controlling so many others wasn't through some collection of skills but instead managed by a high-level soul spell, but it was one unlike anything the world had created before and in essence, replicated more than a few of his own abilities. It dominated others like hive mind, it linked it to others like bind and connect, but the worst part was that all of that was to serve the greater purpose of trying to expand its own mind as far as it could. Seeing the future was difficult. Seeing it efficiently was more so, but it had created what Ben couldn't deny felt like a brilliant workaround to enhance its own abilities. By expanding its mental power with each new target it took in, it was able to use their brains to look at more futures, expanding its own abilities far beyond what he would have considered the limits of the magic to turn prophesy into something so much more viable than it had ever been used before, and in a way that couldn't help leave him as jealous as he was impressed. This demon was in essence using others to replicate the earliest levels of unnatural mind, but its natural affinities let it do things that Ben would never be able to. If it wasn't a monster he had to kill, then he would have wanted to spend hours picking its brain for all it was worth to see what other ideas existed within it. Eye on the prize, Ben. This thing needs to die, and sooner rather than later too, so I've got to figure out how to make that happen. From what he'd seen, he could tell that the limits of its precognition were seeing up to 5 minutes in the future. That meant he needed to find a way to kill it where by the time it realized what was happening it would be too late to escape. It had Phone with his awakened lightning and mace skills, Pado with his awakened space and death magics, and Thera who was an endless fountain of power for the magics she held, all to defend itself. He didn't know where to begin, but he knew the longer he waited the worse his odds would get. The demon that had them hadn't seemed immediately comfortable using their skills, but that would change before long as it got practice with managing their power, and by then it would be too late to do anything. He was already on a time limit, he just needed to make the most of it. With the information he'd wanted acquired, Ben took the others and began to move. The fact the demon had killed itself before they'd arrived meant the jig was up. The one controlling it was aware of their presence and would likely be doing what it could to catch them. They just needed time to arrive, and with an awakened space mage on their side, he didn't want to wait around to see how long that would take as he began pulling things from his rings to make what he could. The first of which ended up using 10 of his new guns. Able to endlessly fire off ammo. He hadn't even had the chance to properly use them yet, and he was already breaking them apart to harvest the voidstone within, wanting that material's properties for the first idea he'd had for handling the time limit of the demon's prophecy. Even if it was going to depend on how well he could time things as he began enchanting on it, managing to get the magic placed down successfully after dividing his total volume into 3, which left him needing to pull out 3 more of his guns than he'd hoped to get the 4th. That meant he only had 7 left, the recent redundancy of his creation showing its worth as he shoved the materializers that had been being held within the guns back into his rings. Even as a question sprung into his mind. Each of them had souls built in to power them. Shouldn't he take that power for himself to use in a situation like that? The lives and safety of himself and Thera were at stake along with the rest of their group. Things had clearly progressed to the point of a full-blown emergency. Wasn't that the time? No, I need to be able to overcome this. The entire point of not bringing the Church of Myriad with him was to ensure he wouldn't have endless power available to him to face his problems given the coming future where doing such a thing was going to be a place of vulnerability. He couldn't just steal power to face any challenges before that when he was supposed to be doing his best to make sure he could make the most of his own strength, even if that fact left his stomach in knots. He was essentially putting people's lives at risk in the name of practice, with one life in particular he cared deeply about, but he was still looking to a future beyond that instead of giving everything he could at that moment. The fact he was able to compartmentalize to such an extent made him question how much of what his mind had become could still be called human, but he pushed the thought away. It didn't matter because at the very least, with the strength he had, he knew he'd be able to save Thera. Really, the main issue was the risk he'd be under for trying to do it, not her when all of the power she held would be pointed at him, and as for the others, well, I'll do my best. If I can't beat one demon without relying on overfilling my soul, then that just means I've never had a shot to begin with and need to start devoting myself to a different plan. It was while he was grappling with himself like that as they ran that the first of the demon's pawns arrived, Pato in front of him and already casting his next spell as he appeared, forcing Ben to throw himself out of the way while grabbing hold of the others to do the same, narrowly avoiding being teleported who could say where while another spell was already being cast. The speed of it telling Ben that the demon in control had gotten better at using those in its thrall with all of the danger that implied. But with a spell of his own, Ben shot out a cloud of stone around him, hitting the other summoned but to no effect, with the light, desperate blow being shrugged off without any attempt to dodge. Why bother when all paths to the future showed how harmless it was going to be? You might be reading a stolen copy. Visit Royal Road for the authentic version. At the very least, if there was any harm to be had, it wouldn't be making itself known in the next 5 minutes and trying to make it appear like a random choice. Ben began running with the rest, vaguely in both the direction he felt bind and where he knew the demon in control was. He wasn't going to go right at them. He didn't want to give any indication he was doing anything other than running away to make it the demon's choice to send Thera his way or to attack him itself while Pato stayed on his heels, seeming more that content to keep forcing him forward by throwing out casual attacks to keep them running as bits of space and death magic went off, continually forcing them forward while Ben's attention was divided between the world around them and the gods above. Myriad, tell me as we're running if you see any demons preemptively move out of our way, but only after I've passed them, okay? If he's not going for the kill, then I have the wiggle room. What? Damn it, okay then. Keep telling me until I say you can stop. He felt his feet pounding against the ground as he ran with all he had while Pato avoided that same fate. Anytime he fell too far behind, he teleported right at the edge of Ben's range, firing off a new attack and forcing them to dodge each time, with the attacks constantly feeling closer despite the continued misses. Damn it. And I don't know, it's all feeling close but not overwhelmingly so, and I'm not feeling Thera moving closer, which is what I think it would really be utilizing if it wanted to kill us, but on the other hand, it has a few more options for figuring things out than I do, so all I can do is my best to plan more than 5 minutes into the future. God damn it! The fact the demons around kept preemptively avoiding him was as annoying as it was expected, and each time he tried to alter how he was using Connect to see if he could get through, using lighter and lighter touches each time while planning out exactly what he'd do without straying to avoid splitting the future in a way that the watching demon would be able to see to give the game away. But he was reaching the limits of his skill. He'd never needed to worry about having a delicate touch before beyond just making sure his mind didn't kill or cripple anyone exposed to it. The fact that the link that bound the horde was so delicate was a major issue when breaking it in the future would act as a warning sign in the present to the demon in control, forcing him to practice blind while he was running for his life with the others to worry about too, only changing the second he had his success. The connection was made to a hidden demon as Ben felt its mind and going no further, let it break as he continued on. His first success with a need to get at least a few more under his belt. If he could touch their minds without being noticed, then that was a good step on the road to fighting a prophet, but he wanted to understand the link that bound them deeper, so he continued on, hearing his god speak up at each new failure as he did. Ugh! It was aggravating, not a way he'd ever choose to train if he had the choice, and with the feeling that he was failing to lure Thera to him, he couldn't help but wonder if he was doomed to failure in the end, if despite the strategies he was trying to make, maybe facing off against something that could predict so many of his moves was simply too much. In the end, he didn't have time to worry about it. It wasn't Thera who came for him but Phone, the Oni standing in the woods to block his path, mace in his hands and lightning on his fingertips. Okay, I'm officially significantly less sure they aren't just trying to kill me. That was the thought he had while dodging to the side mere milliseconds before the attack was shot, as he was forced to wonder just how often he was avoiding bad endings for himself and the others. If they were seriously attacking him and the goal wasn't to lure him, then that meant there was at least one branch of the future where it worked and possibly more. He had to assume that if killing or incapacitating him was the goal, then it must have seen some path to victory, especially since he hadn't been putting so many of his minds to random options to create more to choose from. It was a strategy he'd seen success with before, but not one he wanted to try again until he was close enough to his victory to make it count. limiting his futures all the more as he kept himself from harming his dominated allies while he did his best to make the most of the possibilities he had. More lightning came and Pato attacked where he dodged too, creating a zone that drained the vitality of those who entered it, with Ben making sure he took the brunt of the attack since he had skills that could help him deal with it, and he once more carelessly fired off a hail of small stones towards them. Spending far too much power for an attack they shrugged off as he ran, trying to think of enough potential options of what he might do to at least complicate their attack against him. Myriad 1 to 1000, go. Got it. The future split and collapsed as he ran, taking advantage of the situation and skills to put to use a topic he was an expert in but rarely got to enjoy in its standard capacity. As he further deepened his connection to the other three, he'd taken over to indulge in a perfect act of ritual magic, able to manage it without flaw as he cast for the others instead of relying on the slim chance they might master the impromptu timing of a technique none of them had practiced before as magics merged and blended before being let out into the world as a whole. With all of the knowledge Ben could apply to a spell he'd thought of only seconds before taking full effect. A level 1 light, fire, and water magic, a level 2 air, a level 7 corpse song, and then Ben's 3 awakened options as well. Those were the tools he had to play with when trying to single-handedly form a ritual, and he used his material manipulation as the base, building it up with the rest of the options while he did his best to tie them all into something usable. Pato vanished the instant the spell was cast, the demon controlling him already able to see how the fight would turn out, and withdrew its teleporter, but it wasn't able to save Phone as the woods came alive around him. Trees bending and roots shot out from the ground below to ensnare their target in a poor replication of plant magic with the options he had on hand, empowered further beyond their lower levels with the application of what mana modifiers he could create with their varying skill levels. This story has been taken without authorization. Report any sightings. At a certain point, Phone stopped trying to fight, just going still and speaking of just how sure his capture had been while Ben continued to run away. If there'd been any potential to escape, then he was sure there would have been an attempt at it, but once all doors were closed, what was the point? It could surely also see that Ben had no intention of killing the man, so that meant there'd be time to escape soon enough as they ran away. The entire time, Ben was doing his best to make it feel like he'd just picked a direction and stuck with it, but it was all to keep bringing him closer to his true targets. Doing all he could to narrow the gap as he felt himself connect to another demon mind without Myriad tell him he'd missed it too late. A fact that told him what he was about to do had worked as he lightly touched it and the link to the demon controlling the one hiding in the bushes nearby, feeling it hold without informing them of his presence. He could also feel that demon was about to jump out to attack him unlike the others he'd passed, but he didn't so much as blink, refusing to give anything away when he finally had his chance, and as the world around him dropped to slow motion and the demon lunged out, he continued to examine the way it was being controlled. When he'd examined the dead one through the lens of Azizal's magic, he'd thought it had been controlled in a way that mirrored a few of the skills he held, bind included, and now able to look at an active example of it, he could see how right he was. What enabled the control may have been an act of magic, but just like his skill, it was a stretched-out piece of the demon's soul itself linked to the other that allowed it to take over, an insidious thread making a domineering link to overpower whatever it could get for itself. There was surely some limit to it in range or number of bodies it could manage, but he didn't have the time to test and figure that out then and there. He didn't have days to study it to try and find some clever solution. He could only use the options he had in hand and followed one of the paths he could see in that demon's head where he escaped and drew closer to the one controlling things from the background. He'd narrowly escaped, even if another problem took its place. Among all of the futures he'd seen in that brief connection, many were telling him that his 3 companions were only going to hold him back as things were. He may have had complete control over them, but in too many futures he had to either act to save them or put himself in harm's way to keep them protected, same as he'd done during Pato's attack. It was something he thought he'd be able to put off until later, but with the way things were going, he held out one of the Voidstone pieces he'd enchanted on earlier, taking Azizal and Juiz into it in the same way he'd trapped the immortal Rook in the past. Unlike that last time, the area within the space would be both tighter but also slowed down, with how long the enchantments would keep up before decaying away being limited to a day in case it somehow got lost, but with them safe he let himself be picked up by the remaining one, using Quemet's strength while he could to give his own body a rest as they rushed on to the heart of their demonic swarm. The future it wanted refused to arrive. It was a problem the demon hadn't faced since it had been nothing more than a beast. No matter what it did, No matter how it approached the issue or what branch it tried to zero in on, it couldn't bring its desires to reality, with them consistently left just beyond any path it could see. Its target, the resident of the world it had come to claim, had kept avoiding capture no matter what path the demon tried to herd it onto, even splitting probabilities once more in the few times it felt like it was close, continuing to gain some new way to escape each time as mortal limits were pushed, making it feel like reality itself was on that creature's side. If the demon wanted to take it for itself, then it needed to be able to push past limits of its own, but every time the thing it wanted created more futures, the demon was stalled in a way that couldn't help but enrage it, even if it continued to tell itself it was nothing but a matter of time. If the creature was able to break the thread of itself the demon sent out while it was conscious, then it just needed to wait for it to not be, either once it fell asleep or once it was beaten into submission, with the second feeling like the preferred option by the minute. But no matter how much the demon ground its teeth in frustration, it couldn't deny that things weren't all negative. Its fightful prize may have been avoiding it until that point, but it was going deeper into the heart of its territory, slowly surrounding itself with the waiting limbs, and just as important, it seemed to be weakening as well. It was no longer breaking off as many limbs in the paths that the demon saw, meaning it didn't need to move them away before it arrived, and spoke of a potential growing limitation to how long it would be able to keep doing that in general. There was even a chance that it would only be a little while longer until it was too weak to save itself should it come down to it, letting the demon take it over without having to risk anything in the end. For weakened it seemed, and not insignificantly so. After a previously failed surprise attack, it had one of its more powerful companions carry it forward afterwards, while the other two vanished. It was a result that created questions, of course, but seeing as it hadn't saved itself, it couldn't have been sending them to safety either. Ensure your favorite authors get the support they deserve. Read this novel on the original website. So then what had happened? Was it some waiting trap sitting outside of the range it could see? The demon's instincts said that wasn't so, but it couldn't understand what other option there could be, leaving it to accept that no matter how infuriating, it would just have to wait for them to appear on its paths again. And as for its main target, as much as the demon had hoped to do things more safely, it was all coming to a head. As much as it enraged it, this was the exact challenge its god had wanted it to gain with its early arrival on the world, and now that it was there and waiting, it couldn't back down. It needed to take the experience for all it was worth to grow beyond its limits into something more, and to make that happen it began its work creating its own future. With a perfect knowledge of exactly where its target was, it could tell that it was walking near its general direction, and a few of the paths it could take would bring it close, but while the demon's gentler attempts to herd it had been working so far compared to its failure to incapacitate it, it was quickly becoming time to lay on a heavier touch as it looked at the options it had and the paths that would create. It still hadn't sent out its most powerful limb. The demon was still trying to understand the depths of the abilities it held beyond its magic, which had led it to holding that one back despite its strength, and if used in tandem with its space mage, that created the potential for a potent combination of powers. Soon, the one it held that possessed such a powerful lightning would be able to work itself free too. If it was brought and all three were used in tandem, then perhaps that would be a chance. Or perhaps not. Why was it still trying to play it so safe when its prey drew ever closer? Why was it holding back inferior resources when some small sacrifices could get the demon a new limb that would be able to create whatever futures it desired? With those questions at the core of it, it looked again, not just bringing in those three and not just adding the other powerful force it had caught with them. As its target moved through the woods, it reached out to everything it had in the surroundings and began to pull it all in, closing the space to trap it completely before beginning to move its true self as well. Stretching its body to prepare for whatever might come, the demon felt a small jolt of excitement reach to its core. It was cautious, yes, but that wasn't the true nature of its kind. It was meant to be a predator, and it was going to act like it, so examining every path it could in the time it had, the demon sought to pick whichever ones would bring its desire into reality. It would meet its target, and should everything else fail it, the demon would break the thing's body until it was nothing more than a crippled vessel for whatever mind it held, letting it use the creature's brain for its own purposes to take full advantage of as it went out further to kill the world around it. Yeah, no kidding. Despite the modifications Vividus placed on Quemet's body, I'm pretty sure I'm going to need to put her away with the others soon and start running on my own 2 feet. It was a nice little break while it lasted, at least. Interesting, how long do you think I have then? Okay, that's maybe possibly manageable. Sure, either I manage it or I don't. That sounds pretty manageable to me, I'd say. I think I've got this, he clarified. But given the nature of what I'm trying to go up against, I can't exactly give a certain answer, now can I? I could never lie to you, buddy. No, what you're remembering is going to mostly be me strategically withholding information. Now quiet for a second. I need to commit to the idea that I'm not going to attack whatever demon's running the show if I get the chance. So I can get close enough that it won't be able to escape me by the time I will be attacking him once he can see this in the future. Except if I succeed at getting close, then can't I alter the existing paths to attack it early? Okay, not doing that, but prophecy is annoyingly paradoxical to deal with. I genuinely feel my mind straining as I try and work out all of the little subtle implications of everything I might do and how that relates to a being that can see the future going up against someone who can plan for it seeing the future. I think if the demons have any other time magic users like this, then I'm going to just give up and let myself die in slightly less hassle. Unauthorized use. This story is on Amazon without permission from the author. Report any sightings. As Myriad said that, a group of demons jumped from the woods, their aim to push Ben closer to Thera and the ringleader of it all, and he let it happen. If the monster managing all of that wanted to end things as well, then he wasn't going to fight it. He just needed to give everything he had to come out on top. He ran as fast as he could while using the Chimera's legs as a growing crowd of demons followed behind. None of them worried about staying too far away anymore now that he'd gotten the hang of connecting to them without breaking the link that made them another demon's slaves, and it only drove him faster while he occasionally fired shots back. With their numbers reaching the dozens by then, and only growing as more joined, it was impossible not to miss, prophecy or not, and it was like that he took his potshots, pulling out his remaining guns to do it with the 7 of them hanging in the air around them, while he occasionally pulled the trigger with his magic to get as many killed as he comfortably could. Comfortably having special emphasis. He believed he could have killed many more, but he was walking a balancing act of trying to make sure the demon watching through those dozens of eyes neither grew afraid of his strength nor suspicious of how gentle he was being. He needed to look like a potential threat, but not one that couldn't be overcome as he drew ever closer to his target and finally felt the other end of bind move. Perfect-ish. A little tighter than I hoped, but I'll make it work. With what he was about to face moving his way, he touched Kay-Emit with the Void Stone holding the other 2, trapping her away and leaving Ben alone to deal with what was to come as the woods collapsed around him. Thera's power on full display as swaths of earth were thrown aside to clear the land and limit his options to let him see her in full display. She was still hovering in the air, presumably to limit his futures, and he could see the rest of the chimeras behind her with the rest of Pato's party and a few demons mixed in, with one standing out more than the others. The very one Ben had gotten to see through Azizal's magic, with a figure smaller than what he was used to seeing in the race, it standing shorter than himself with an almost center-like body plan, was the demon who'd been pulling the strings from the shadows, finally out to join the fight. Ben didn't know the reason why. As convenient as it was for him, it did mean it was putting itself in a position of vulnerability, but it didn't matter. All of the remaining players were there for him to enact his plan. He just needed to survive long enough to pull it off. With approximately 7 minutes to deal with Thera if I want this to work. Oh damn it, this really is a bit tighter than I'd hoped. Why couldn't this stupid thing have sent her out first? What that really meant was he had 2 minutes to do what he needed to before the demon would be able to realize that something was wrong, and Ben would have to do it while fighting to survive. Something easier in theory than in practice, as he subtly actualized around a small tool, so he could move it to his will. At the same moment a pillar of earth appeared under his feet, shooting him into the sky. As he was flung upward into the sky above, Ben brought the majority of his minds to their fastest speeds to deal with everything the best he could, even with one thought ringing clear through it all. Oh, this is really going to hurt. He could already feel a strain on his mind as he continued to actualize, as the distance he was doing it at forcefully increased by so much, but he didn't let it down, instead focusing on his goal as he let himself slowly fall back, counting seconds as he did. 113 until the demon seized the future. With the height he'd been thrown making him think he had roughly 8 seconds until he hit the ground and would be faced with his untimely demise if he didn't do anything, made more complicated by what he was seeing below. Every one of the enthralled was preparing to cast the best they could while he was helplessly suspended in the air, with that fact shaping his plans as he split his focus between that and his continued actualization. Looking at the world in slow motion, he focused on both, trying to control where he'd eventually land and understanding the structures of the various spells as they came together. Trying to properly judge their affinity as they were being constructed while he focused on which would be harmful and which he could use, judging most spells to be unfortunately death affinitied while a few others took up the remaining options and forced him to question how he'd deal with it. His outfit would be able to handle most of it, and he even wanted to take some hits. Any earth, water, and air attacks that hit his jacket or pants wouldn't be able to bypass his current enchantments while having the small bonus of slowing his descent, but the other affinities held different issues. He wasn't completely covered after all, his hands and face were exposed, and while he trusted his resistances and various defensive skills to protect him up to a certain point, he didn't want to put complete faith in them when he had so many attacks aimed at those vulnerable areas. So he prepared to deal with them the best he could without spending too much mana, continuing to count the seconds until they arrived until, just before any hit, he materialized a leather-like material around his head and hands while spending the extra mana to cover it with the enchantments he already intended to let him take the hits. He'd been watching until the very last second to try to judge what other attacks were coming while also reaching out with his material sense to try and feel more, but the second it seemed the blows had stopped he removed his face covering, needing access to his eyes and praying that the demons down below hadn't been able to judge what had happened well enough to plan another attack through that flurry of spells. Hope that was proven right. No matter how powerful they were, they couldn't plan or react as fast as him, and with the way he was still falling through the sky, whatever split-second reactions he'd make weren't going to be clear no matter how many eyes were on him, letting him go on from there as he drew ever closer to the ground. The story has been taken without consent. If you see it on Amazon, report the incident. With 107 seconds to finish. Oh, please, please, please let me get lucky here. Still actualizing as stealthily as he could, doing his best to make his mental construct blend in with the scenery around it. He continued to bring it ever closer to its target, slowly and stealthily while also being faced with his impending fall, with the question of how much he was willing to let it hurt feeling uncomfortably present. It needed to look good. He had to make the demon think he was being pushed into a corner, but at the same time it had to be to an extent where it wouldn't be obvious he had been faking it as he got up once more as he was forced to continue to balance pain and potential in the face of prophecy. With one thing becoming more and more clear. I hate time magic so incredibly much. He could feel himself turning against the very idea of prophecy now that he'd encountered a creature that could use it so freely, but did his best to hold back on that new bit of spite as he tried to subtly slow his descent by filling his clothing with his mana and pulling back against his body weight, hoping the demon wouldn't notice the subtle change as he plummeted towards the ground. So much of what he was doing was just trying to outsmart the other to beat out the future, and it was all wearing on him as he was forced to try and think farther and farther ahead to deal with it. It felt like his mind was under a constant strain that was pushing him against his upper limits. Combined with the ache in his soul from how he actualized, and he could already tell he was going to need either a good day of rest or a trip to a soul mage to recover. Either would make for a decent option so long as he lived to see it, but with time nearly at a standstill for him when he was only 10 feet from the ground, he put as much faith into his defense skills as he could while trying to rapidly slow his fall, feeling his outfit strain against his flesh while new actualized constructs appeared beneath him, killing his momentum in a way that felt akin to running face first into a wall but left him largely uninjured by the time he'd actually hit the ground itself. He was sore all over and he'd had the wind knocked out of him, but he could get up to fight and he would live. All that mattered was making it look good as he staggered to his feet while new attacks were already coming his way. 100 seconds remaining. Feeling his time limit, Ben pushed harder, avoiding what spells he could while letting himself take what hits he had to while moving forward, seeing the demon watch him with glee as it thought it was winning, that even if it couldn't see a future yet where it got him, it was narrowing it down as it continued to look ahead, blind to the present where the first step of its loss arrived. No longer needing to keep up his actualization, Ben instead spent a bit of his mana from the distance he was at, binding one item to another while feeling himself smile. Without anything else knowing it, he'd officially just take Thera, Phone, and Pato off of the playing field. All that was left was to wait and create all the more confusion he could. 90 seconds left. With his first plan done, he continued to count seconds until the time the demon would see its inevitable future came forth, waiting for what was sure to be a brilliant distraction but forced himself to continue to jump and dodge in the meantime as he avoided as many spells as he could, feeling his body wear down in the process. He was straining himself, but he couldn't help it. He was one man against a swarm that was only growing by the minute, even as he fired back when he could to try and thin them out. The demons of the woods were descending on him, with his only benefit being that none were coming too close, instead choosing to fire their spells while keeping some room between them. It was a gap he'd need to break eventually, but the window for it was on its way. With only 10 seconds left until the demon would see the future Ben had worked so hard to create, he took all but 200 of his many minds and directed the rest to finding different options for how he wanted to face the future, splitting it into hundreds of thousands of potential paths and stunning the demon in control at the same moment it would have seen the true endpoint Ben had created. It was enough to create a distraction, though, pushing that discovery off just a bit farther as he used that window to shoot himself forward, activating his shoes for all of the extra speed he could get to break the distance between them as the demon looked on, first preparing to reacting but freezing again in realization, with whatever it had been trying to do drawing attention to the end point of all of its paths no matter what it picked. One where the awakened skill holders it had brought into its thrall had all disappeared. It was a future it couldn't figure out how to prevent, and one that Ben had begun working on creating hours earlier, back when he'd harvested all of his Voidstone from his guns that he could. One piece had gone towards holding Azizal, Kmit, and Juiz, but it was the three left that really mattered. Both times Ben had attacked Pato and Phone by trying to batter them away with a swarm of pebbles. He'd snuck a piece of enchanted Voidstone into each of their clothing, using his magic to bind it to the fabric so they'd be locked in place no matter where either of those two ran, and then doing something similar to Thera. In her case, he had no choice but to be subtler with it, though. When he'd attacked the other two, it hadn't been worth the effort to dodge, when the demon could see they'd come out unscathed, but in her case, he could easily imagine a future where it used the barest fraction of her power to block the attack, forcing him to use his mind instead as he actualized around it to slowly carry the small stone over until he could cast his magic to bind it to her outfit in the same way, with all of it leading to that one result as the demon began to panic. While it could hypothetically avoid that future if it found the stones or thought to do something like stripping them, Ben knew from personal experience that it didn't matter how smart one was or how far ahead they could think. There would always be blind spots in one's thoughts that weren't so easily dealt with its continued flailing making that more and more apparent. It didn't know what to do about whatever was happening, and the time limit was approaching as fast as Ben as he ran to the demon, talking to Myriad as he did to keep the futures around him as varied as possible. "Give me a number." Futures collapsed as Ben materialized oil under around the feet of some nearby demon before casting an enchantment on a bit of stone to make it combust and threw it over, lighting them on fire. Again, this text was taken from Royal Road. Help the author by reading the original version there. More materializing as Ben took a deep breath before he created 2 large blocks of frozen gas in among the crowd that rapidly melted around them and forced everything to deal with its effects. He'd materialized the one with the lowest freezing point he was aware of, and by being created in an otherwise warm woods it instantly began to sublimate into a super-chilled gas that began freezing the area around it while others breathed it in. It wouldn't kill anyone, but it would be far from pleasant. Even he could feel its bite on his skin in a way he expected would need to be healed later, and with it choking out the air around them it would leave plenty lightheaded until it dispersed as he continued to shrink the distance. Again, an aspect of actualization that time as he got closer, materializing boiling metal to rain down around them in a way that continued to strain his mind as everything within range screamed. He knew from his testing that it was transmitting the feeling of extreme heat in a way that would cause overwhelming pain, but for whatever reason, there was no genuine energy being transmitted. In essence, it was a psychic attack of sorts meant to cause suffering and nothing else, not that his targets would be aware of that. Even if they could see the future and tell they'd live through it, that didn't make the agony any less real while he was maintaining it. Ben could see all of this was straining the demon too, providing too much stimulus from both Ben's attacks as well as all of the futures he kept creating as he chose one and moved to the next, ultimately leading to Ben's victory. He'd sworn to himself that no matter what happened he wouldn't attack the demon in control until the 5 minutes he'd needed had passed, and he had forced himself to abide by that with every fiber of his being. If even a fraction of him planned on attacking when he got in range, then that would lead to an avenue where it could see what he was planning and try to stop it. So even once Ben had his victory by blocking those futures and reaching into the demon's mind, he didn't end things there. He'd blocked that path from himself in order to get so close, and while a part of him knew it wouldn't matter now that he was already within range, dealing with prophecy had proven complicated enough, as he instead used his massive mind to process all the demon was seeing to pick the futures he wanted for himself. An outcome the demon didn't understand. All at once, the futures he was seeing had changed, no longer having hundreds of thousands to try and process but instead only a couple, but each time it moved to take advantage of one it saw them completely change before its eyes, not understanding that Ben was reacting to its thoughts to alter the outcome before it could begin, nor knowing how outmatched it was. It may have been using hundreds of minds to process the futures around it, but it was now facing off against thousands and was being backed into a corner. It knew if it wanted to live, then it needed to either go beyond its limits or run away, and now that it seemed outmatched despite the numbers it had, the choice felt obvious as it tried to bring Pato to it, only for that to be foiled the second he arrived. When Pato appeared, already preparing to teleport the demon away, Ben was already attacking him with more bujal stored in one of his rings, binding the other fast enough that bones were surely broken, but succeeded in ripping away his mana as well, leaving him unconscious and the demon trapped as fear started to claw at it. Now somehow escaping really was the only option, as it desperately tried to see how, using everything under its thrall to think harder as their minds were pushed while its time magic was pressed even further, trying to go beyond its limits in the face of what it had found. It had wanted a new limb, a mind and body to make its own, but it had found an unbelievable monster that could warp futures faster than it could see. Every move it could make was being countered before it could make it, and pressed the beast to strain itself all the more, feeling its eyes bleed and its brain begin to break down under the pressure as it struggled for any possible means of survival, as it saw future after future where it was either killed or taken over itself, and once the first time limit passed and its most powerful limbs disappeared, fulfilling the future where they were pulled into the enchanted voidstone Ben had bound to them, that desperation made something change. In a moment of clarity, it felt the wall it had been pressing up against come down as notifications rang out in its head, telling it and Ben of just what the pressure it had been applying had accomplished as a flash of mana lit the forest.